Welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast. I am the host, Gaute Einvoll. Beginning master and PhD students in neuroscience may have different motivations for choosing this particular field. One motivation could be simply to understand how their brain works. Another could be to learn from the brain how to build better artificial intelligence. A third could be to help cure brain diseases, maybe after seeing a grandparent affected by dementia. Then you dive into a specific narrow problem, hopefully get excited about it, feel the joy of finding out something new, and write your thesis about your results. If you continue in science after a PhD degree, you may write applications for research funding, where you, in order to increase the chance of getting funded, maybe claim, whether it's plausible or not, that your planned research project should give insights which may lead to new cures for brain diseases. We are all for curing brain diseases, obviously, but how often has it really happened in practice? That is, how often has discoveries made in neuroscience labs doing basic research actually turned into new drugs or treatments of brain diseases? Today's guest, Nicole Rust, an accomplished professor of neuroscience working on the visual system at the University of Pennsylvania, did something unusual. She took time off from her own particular research focus to look into this broader question regarding the overall neuroscience endeavor, and in particular its clinical impact. Her findings were described in a book, Elusive Cures, that came out this summer. The subtitle of the book, Why Neuroscience Hasn't Solved Brain Disorders and How We Can Change That, gives away the main message of the book. I really liked the book, not only because I learned a lot about history and current status and limitations of clinical neuroscience, as well as the unfortunately limited impact from basic neuroscience as of yet. I also liked it because it's not a book where the author claims to alone have the answers on how to fix the problem. It's more of a call to arms for the whole field to take a bird's eye view on how we are doing our science and maybe how to try to do it better. A key claim in the book is that we need to move beyond what Nicole calls linear thinking when it comes to brain disease. An example of such linear thinking is the one gene, one drug, one disease approach that was a dominant hope during the molecular biology revolution in the 1980s and 90s. With such linear thinking, the action of the system is thought of as a chain of dominoes, so fixing the systems correspond to fixing the appropriate domino piece, for example, a faulty gene. Instead, Nicole says we need to think of the brain as a complex adaptive system. A complex adaptive system is a system made up of many interacting components, each of which can adapt or change in response to both their environment and to each other. In the context of a network of neurons, modeling the system as a purely feed-forward network corresponds to linear thinking. While in the complex adaptive system thinking, there are also key feedback and recurrent connections between the neurons, maybe operating at a range of different timescales. When many different things happen at the same time, like in a complex adaptive system, we need mathematical modeling. Thus, computational neuroscience will need to be a key ingredient when exploring such systems. Towards the end of the podcast, we discuss what Nicole calls the grand plan for neuroscience in terms of understanding the brain and finding cures for brain diseases. While most active neuroscience researchers obviously must spend most of their time focusing on their specific, often narrow research topic, I think it's healthy that we sometimes think about the overall goal of neuroscience and how we as a field can get there. We must be careful that we don't focus so narrowly on our own little tree that we forget about the overall forest. If you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/theoretical neuroscience podcast and choose a membership of your liking, for example at the cost of $1 per month. As a member, you will get access to a video version of the podcast recordings, as well as transcripts of each episode. And note that there is a 7-day free trial period when you sign up. I also have a YouTube channel called Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast, where you also can watch the videos. I will be most grateful if you become a Patreon supporter to help me fund the production of the podcast, even if you're not too interested in looking at the videos. But I also appreciate all the other listeners and hope that all of you can help spread the word about the podcast to other people in the community on social media or otherwise. Okay, here is Nicole. So, welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience podcast, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Goethe. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I mean, you are a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and you sort of worked on vision for a long time, and now also mood. But in some sense, you have taken some time off to take a step back to take a bird's eye look at the view at neuroscience as a whole, and you just written the book Elusive Cures that came out in early June or something. So, which is very nice, and I highly recommend to everyone. But I guess the main message or the starting point is that the field of neuroscience is not doing too well when it comes to curing brain diseases, right?
Well, certainly, I would say it's mixed. Yes.
Yeah.
So there are, I don't want to make it sound like nothing has been happening. So let's talk about the success stories first, and then we
Okay.
can dive into where we're falling short.
Mhm.
So, indisputably, brain researchers who are just focused on how does the brain work, I would say, have been kind of knocking it out of the park with regard to just collecting facts, making the pages in our textbooks, just mounting them up,
Yeah.
getting thicker and thicker and thicker. So we're
Yeah.
understanding a lot about the brain at a pretty rapid clip. There are also classes of disorders in which we have had game-changing therapies like migraine headaches or postpartum depression, certain classes of disorders. But there are other classes of disorders which despite all these facts we've been collecting, we still don't seem to see through to that end goal of treatments. And I would put those in three classes. So we have our neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, our neuropsychiatric conditions like depression, anxiety, psychosis, and the neurodevelopmental conditions. In all of these cases, we don't really understand what's causing these disorders, and we're having a hard time coming up with new treatments. So when I wrote Elusive Cures, I really wanted to focus on those aspects of, what is it that there seems to be a disconnect between what we're learning and our end goals for society.
Mm. Because one, I think you also quote like I think Thomas Insel, who was the director of NIMH. I also read I think a perspective article about with Steve Hyman, which I echo the same thing. That is sort of we have spent all this money on brain research, and we still do not. Well, we haven't really made that much headway in coming up with cures for mental disorders. And I guess also the pharmaceutical companies have pulled back from this because they had some really expensive misses in the
Yes,
past, and also lack
absolutely.
of new good leads.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not just in the US. We also have the Wellcome Trust, who points to troubling disconnections between what we're learning and the end goals for society. And so, yeah, when
Mhm.
I set out to write this book, it was really, uh, for me, it was in part a personal journey, just trying to ask the question, why are we falling short? And it could be a couple different reasons. On one hand, the brain is held up as the most complex thing in the known universe. And so maybe, we've only been at this about a century or so in any sort of serious way. So maybe the gap there is just we haven't figured it out yet, but we're on the right track. Alternatively, it could be that we really are on the wrong train, right? And so
Yeah,
we need to
absolutely.
rethink how we're going about things.
Mhm.
And yeah, just to jump to the punchline, that ended up being the big central thesis of my book, is that for the past 30 years we have been thinking about the brain in a pretty oversimplified way. Due to breakthroughs in technology, we're now ready to really embrace more of the complexity of the brain, and that's going to be meaningful, I think. But it's also going to mean that we have to rethink every step of how we approach science, right?
Well,
So it's going to be a
yeah.
non-trivial
So we
shift.
won't get unemployed. That's
Yeah, we
or
won't get unemployed, but our field is shifting,
yeah.
and so the book is
Mm,
ultimately a book not of pessimism but of
mm,
optimism. So
mm,
asking what needs to happen. Well, it's the thing that's actually happening. That
mm,
was a big wake up call for me.
yeah. I guess
Yeah.
talking about optimism, right? I mean, I guess in the 1980s there was sort of like this big optimism when you got all these new molecular tools, right?
Yes.
This
Yes.
that sort of like one, yeah, and when you found out, like mapped out the genes of
Hmm.
humans,
Hmm.
or first animals and then humans, and then sort of this one gene, one drug, one disease kind of hope, which was, of course, would have been wonderful, but it hasn't quite delivered as hoped.
Yeah, there were two technologies that researchers were really excited about in the 1980s and 1990s, and one of them it was the ability to sequence genes. That was the era of the Human Genome Project, right? So for the first time, we could get the sequence for all the genes. And then the other technology was human functional magnetic resonance
Just go
imaging.
ahead. I just had to close the window. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't worry.
So fMRI. So for the
Yeah.
first time, we could actually look inside the human brain and actually see what's going on there under the hood. And there was just
Mm,
general optimism.
mm.
That doesn't seem unreasonable, right? If we just
No.
sequence genes and image brains, we're going to figure out what causes brain disorders, and that's going to lead
Mm.
us to treatments and cures. And yeah, that hasn't quite panned out.
No. So also this thinking about this is something you talk a lot about. This limitations of what you call linear thinking,
Hmm.
fixing, like fixing defect domino pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this. Uh, Sorry, I'll keep us out of rabbit holes, but yes.
Yeah.
So if you just zoom out and you just
Mm,
ask in the 1990s, how were researchers thinking about the brain? It's pretty easy to infer, and it's actually spelled out very explicitly in this article by Eric Kandel called "A New Intellectual Framework for Psychiatry," but it really describes the dominant ethos of that era. And so the way they were thinking about it, it all begins with genes. Genes are translated into proteins. Proteins combine to form neurons. Neurons are shaped into neural circuits, and it's the activity of those neural circuits that gives rise to all of the brain's functions and also its dysfunctions. And in that type of thinking, there was a single feedback loop from the environment back to shape how our brains are wired up. That, of course, happens via learning. And in Kendel's framework, the idea was that that determines the genes that are expressed. So, this is what was called the molecular neuroscience framework, and you can still see vestiges of it today in textbooks. So, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, I teach Introduction to Neuroscience out of a very popular textbook, and it describes how we'll go about approaching creating new treatments for psychiatric conditions. And it's really summarized in find a gene that might be mutated and inherited by an individual, make a mouse, so recapitulate that genetic mutation, and then create a drug to treat that. Put it through
mm,
clinical trials, right? Find a gene, make a mouse, create a drug.
mm,
As this very simplified idea that, yeah, there are different dominoes in this chain. And any one of those dominoes, if they go awry, that's going to create the end product of dysfunction. But it's a very linear way of thinking. It's either going to be a
mm,
genetic mutation or maybe a brain area that, for whatever reason, has aberrant activity. But when you think about the brain this way and you think about brain dysfunction in this way as broken dominoes, then you want to go in and target those dominoes for a
mm.
fix. That was kind of the ethos of this era.
And I guess one example where this actually is the case is Huntington's disease, right?
Huntington's disease, yep.
Yeah.
There are a handful of disorders, and Huntington's is among them, where Huntington's is a single gene mutation.
Mm,
A couple other disorders, there are rare forms of Alzheimer's disease, which are also single gene mutations that lead to the disease with certainty later in life. That's not true for all forms of Alzheimer's. And then, yeah, there's Fragile X syndrome, which is manifest like autism, and that's also a
yeah.
single gene mutation. In
Mm,
all of those cases, we can't actually treat those diseases
mm,
despite knowing about the mutations for over 30 years. So,
mm,
that right there tells you that even if it's a broken domino in the chain, the
mm,
fix for the broken domino might not be as simple as
mm.
just
Are
targeting
there
that
sort of,
domino for a fix,
yeah?
right? Because
Are
because
there,
we're dealing with systems that are more complicated than
but
that.
like there are, I mean, like this sickle cell anemia. There are some cures. I'm not quite sure if that is at the gene level or
Yeah, no, that
how they
that
do
is
it.
that's there is so gene therapy
Mm,
for sickle cell. We can
mm.
also point to
That's also a single gene thing, isn't it?
yes, yeah, that can
Yeah.
be
Mm,
absolutely, and I would point to spinal motor atrophy (SMA), which is also a single gene mutation, and that also can be treated with a one-time gene therapy. So that's been
okay.
a real success
Wow.
story for
Mm,
kids
yeah.
who are born
Cool.
with that because that degenerates motor neurons
Mm,
and they can't
yeah.
function. So there are some, yes, absolutely,
Mm.
there are some
But
disorders that have
but I
been
guess if yeah, but I
treated
guess if
that
it
way.
yeah. So I guess if you talk about this, like the most like prevalent mental diseases, like maybe like I mean, obviously depression,
Hmm.
anxiety, and schizophrenia, and autism, and bipolar disorders,
Yep.
and then there are many genes involved, right? It's not like a
Yes,
simple
yes,
one gene thing.
absolutely. So that's
Yeah.
been a huge discovery that the minority of disorders can be tied to individual genes. So even in the cases of things like schizophrenia, there are these rare genetic variants that are really strongly tied to the disorders, just as they are in Alzheimer's. But for the most part, those genes are only weakly determinant of schizophrenia. Just to throw up an illustrative statistic, if one identical twin has schizophrenia, the chances of the other genetically identical twin of having schizophrenia as well are only 50%. So here are two individuals, they have the exact same genes, they have the exact same womb environment that they developed in, right? And presumably a lot of other things about their lives are very similar, but you only have a 50% inheritance pattern. So that already tells you there's something more going on than just genes and obvious environmental influences. It's
Hmm.
something much more subtle.
Yeah. So that already exactly. So and there's of course this other major technology development, which is, I think you briefly mentioned it, is brain imaging.
Hmm.
Right, you can now do, I mean, not only like imaging of structure, but like with traditional MRI, but also functional MRI and like other kinds of modalities or measurements of brain activity. But also there, which is a wonderful new technology, but also there, it hasn't really been a game changer when it comes to mental diseases, for example, or brain diseases.
Absolutely. Yeah, the dream of the 1990s was that we would develop biological tests for psychiatric conditions. And
Mm,
to this day, those conditions are still diagnosed based on symptoms alone. So they're quite unique within medicine. So most of medicine, most neurological conditions, they're diagnosed based on biological tests like blood tests and brain scans or but that's not true of the psychiatric conditions. But
mm,
that was explicitly the dream of the 1990s. And it
mm.
almost feels like it has to work, right? So if you could just look under the hood at what's happening in the brain when
Yeah.
somebody goes through a bout of depression or goes through an episode of psychosis, we should be able to detect that, right? Insofar as we all really do believe that it's what's happening, physical changes in the brain give rise to changes in the mind and to behavior. And that
Mm,
hasn't panned out. And it's a really interesting and important conversation about why.
mm,
Um, I think, we could talk about things like the resolution. So, insofar as you're averaging together the responses of a million or so neurons at a time in a voxel, maybe you don't have the resolution that you need in order to really reflect what's happening in the brain. That's one possibility. But there's another set of possibilities I think are also important to consider. And that is, in this class of things that you would want to be able to decipher from the brain, they are things like emotions. And we still don't really know how to decode or read out or decipher how emotions are reflected in the brain. And
mm,
also sanity and psychosis, right? These are things that we haven't quite figured out. So it's not like we figured out these things in principle and we're just
mm,
technologically limited at trying to, get the right measurements in practice. It's like
mm,
even the principles, I think, are the bottleneck in some of these
mm.
cases.
Yeah. So I guess we hope that it would be turn out that we get a pleasant or positive surprise. But I guess both of these two great new technologies, gene technology and like brain imaging, we had high hopes, and it was maybe for good reasons, but it didn't really turn out the way we hoped.
Yeah, and it's really a rough sketch, right? To say, "Oh, we have new technology, jazz hands, we're
Yeah.
gonna figure it all out," right?
Yeah.
So, so yeah, and I think it's something we should really pause and
Yeah.
think about today because now we're excited about all sorts of new technologies, right? We've got optogenetics, and we have CRISPR to edit genes, and we have connectomics to show how all the neurons are connected together. But what are we going to do with all of this data? That's the big question. I think we
Absolutely.
need to think
Of course,
hard
we're
about.
coming back to that. I mean, I think we both agree that like mathematical modeling will be an important component there. Uh,
Absolutely, yeah.
so, but
Mhm.
I mean, there are, at least we have some cures and drugs that are administered to people with those of us with sort of like psychiatric diseases, for example, antipsychotics, sort of like
Yes.
that works against like maybe I should first tell what the psychosis is.
Mhm. Yeah, psychosis can take on different forms like delusions and hallucinations. Also, yeah, so, and there can be many different forms of those delusions and
Mm.
hallucinations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of psychosis in broad strokes.
Because there we have some drugs that works against like or deals with some of the symptoms, right? And but
Mhm.
where do they come from? These drugs.
So the antipsychotics are a really fascinating class of drugs, and they really kind of illustrate how, at least for me, drug development is actually surprising and didn't happen exactly how I thought it did.
Mm,
So I think the classic story you often hear is this bench to bedside narrative, right?
yeah.
Some game changing discovery about the brain leads to a new therapy, and that does happen, but it's more rare than you think. And the antipsychotics really illustrate that. So the first antipsychotic, chlorpromazine, was developed in the 1950s by a French pharmaceutical company. They actually were developing histamines to treat allergies, and they saw that some of their drugs had, as we know, histamines, they have these sedative properties.
Mm,
So one psychiatrist administered this to a patient who was going through an episode of mania and psychosis, and it was instantly calming. So much so that under this drug, that patient was able to be released, which was a big deal because at the time, there was just a lot of concern and frustration because we didn't really know what to do with patients like these. And so, yeah, the drug really caught fire and spread
mm,
to institutions, worldwide.
mm,
Fast forward to today, we now have 26 antipsychotic drugs, but they all work in the same way as that original drug,
I see.
meaning they all bind to the same receptors.
Mm,
What differs between them is the strengths with which they bind to those receptors. The one common receptor they all have in common is a dopamine receptor, it's the D2 receptor, and they bind to other types of receptors as well. And how strongly they bind to those receptors really determines the side effect profile.
mm,
So the drugs were kind of discovered serendipitously before we knew much about at all about what was happening in the brain. Now, when they've been refined to create those additional 25 drugs, those refinements have been based on information about how the brain works since. And one example of that is the drug lumateperone, which is an antipsychotic with reduced side effects. And it was intentionally designed to reduce the side effect of weight gain based on information about
mm,
the receptors you want to bind to versus the ones that you don't. But they all work in the
mm,
same way. So this is not an example of which in which a big discovery about the brain led to a novel therapy that works in a new way. Again, that happens, but that's not the case of the antipsychotics. The antipsychotics are a story in which a serendipitous discovery that happened before we knew much about the brain at all was then used to refine drugs to create new ones, but they don't work any differently than the original drug.
mm. And yeah, I guess also you have like the antidepressants, I guess then which is most, I mean, I would say
Yeah.
like the modern antidepressants, starting I guess with Prozac or the
Mhm.
serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Where did they come from?
Yeah, so the very first antidepressant, which is not one of the modern class, that was also a serendipitous discovery.
Mm,
It was actually in clinical trials for the lung-infecting bacteria tuberculosis. So
mm,
during those clinical trials for TB, the patients were really happy and dancing around, and they thought, "Oh, wow, maybe this would be helpful for
uh,
individuals with depression." So that was the first antidepressant, which kind of keyed
uh,
everyone onto the idea that maybe drugs can enhance mood. And then the modern antidepressants are kind of a mix. There was the discovery that when neurons release neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, there actually is an active reuptake that happens. And that discovery then led to inhibitors of that reuptake to enhance the
mm,
amount of chemicals in the synapse. We still don't know actually how those drugs work because
mm,
that enhancing the chemical levels in the synapse happens pretty quickly after you start taking the drugs. But in terms of the mood uplifting effects, those actually take weeks to kick
mm,
in. So we don't really understand how the drugs work, but those drugs were intentionally, the first generation of those drugs were intentionally designed to block the reuptake. So that's a case in which a discovery about how the brain works, a Nobel Prize winning discovery about how the brain works,
mm,
really did lead to a new therapy. But then there's also this gap. Like, how does
mm.
increasing serotonin in the synapse in a fast time
Exactly.
scale lead to uplifting mood on a weeks long time scale? So we don't
Mm.
really understand. It, it,
Yeah.
it's quite complicated.
Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned other drugs like this in your book, and you should like Ritalin. which is named
Ritalin.
after the wife of the discoverer. I think that's
Yeah, that's a
sort
great
of,
story. So the chemical name is methylphenidate,
okay.
and that happened in the 1940s, where a
Mhm.
chemist in Switzerland, whose job was to create new drugs, and again, he just kind of based on if we have this chemical and we take it, what happens? So he created methylphenidate. He took it
Mm.
himself. Like that was
Okay.
it was just like, oh my goodness, how dangerous could that be?
Yeah.
But he took it on himself, and then he gave some to his wife, and his wife
Mhm.
really liked it because it helped her with her tennis game, and his wife was named Rita, and so that's why Ritalin is called Ritalin. Yeah.
Oh, that's very cute.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
But
I mean,
again, not based on any information about how the brain works. This was a time before we even understood that brains communicate by neurotransmission,
uh,
right? We weren't even there yet. So obviously, uh, Ritalin was not developed based on that knowledge.
because I also read this, well, a little bit of story about the discovery of LSD,
Mm,
the psychedelic, and also that the person who sort of the chemist who sort of got on this, okay, almost like an accident on the first trip, on the way back on the biking, and it was like
yes.
all kinds of strange,
You
but
hear
it also
you hear yeah,
yeah.
you hear these stories. I mean, I think, just to abstract from them, I think it
Mhm.
is important to keep in mind that, there are people out there that are suffering and they
Mhm.
need the better treatments than the ones we can offer them today.
Mhm.
So we shouldn't hold the goal to we are going to figure out everything out in great detail before we try
Mhm.
to create some therapies. We do need to, I think, proceed based on intuitions and hints, and that's how the history of drug discovery really was set up, right? So you get some inkling about this might work. At the same time, we also are in an era in which we don't do that anymore, right? We
Yeah,
don't create
exactly.
drugs and then just give them to people and see what
Yeah.
happens, right?
Uh-huh.
So we have different ways of approaching
Exactly.
all of
So we
this.
don't really have that sort of window towards discoveries because we don't people don't like the chemists don't lick their own chemicals anymore or whatever.
Yes, yes, and you can't if you're a
But I,
psychiatrist, you can't
but
just
I,
like give something to your patient and see what
mm,
happens, right?
but I
Yeah.
heard
So
with this now, of course, there is always this weight loss drugs, like,
mhm.
and I understand that there's been some findings, or maybe I wait a minute, no. So this was I'm confused, but anyway, there was. I mean, sometimes you
No, you're
do
right.
give
Mhm.
something for. There was some side effect of using some weight less, right?
Yes, yes. So
Something
these are the
with yeah.
GLP-1 drugs, and
Uh,
so yes, absolutely. So they were discovered in Gila monsters, right?
mm,
So somebody was just interested in how does the Gila monster go without food
mm,
for a very long time, and then can ingest a huge amount of food, and how does that? That's just kind of a fascinating metabolic question about how do you go from nothing to so much, and how does a physiology deal with that?
mm,
So that was very foundational research that
mm,
then led to this new class of drugs, which is extremely effective for weight loss in
mm,
individuals. And that's important given the obesity epidemic we have worldwide, especially in the United States right now.
mm,
And yes, there are these really interesting side effects. Like there are now clinical trials to, um, uh, because it's kind of a craving related system, it
mhm.
seems like it's also reducing craving for other things. So,
Yeah,
alcohol use disorder and other types of
mm,
substance use disorders, for
yeah,
example, might be an
like,
interesting side benefit of those drugs. So,
and I
yeah.
guess also when you have so many people who take these drugs, it's I guess like this Danish company who made one of them is like the biggest company in the Nordic countries now. I think the Novo Nordic or whatever. But so when you have so many people taking these drugs, then you also get a large cohort to study, right?
Absolutely. And
So
there are
it's
other
good.
stories like that too. There's a form of, so for intractable epilepsy,
Mm,
one treatment is vagus nerve stimulation. So the vagus nerve is a nerve in the neck,
mm,
and stimulating it for some individuals is effective at eliminating or reducing epileptic seizures.
yeah.
A byproduct of that they found is it's also mood uplifting, and so it's now
Oh,
also a treatment for intractable
uh-huh.
depression when
Wow.
other
Wow.
forms, less invasive
Yeah.
forms, don't. Yeah, so
Yeah.
so there's lots of this,
Mhm.
yeah, kind of serendipitous. Oh, we tried it for one purpose, and then we realized it has
Mm.
another benefit, and it's completely legitimate. Again,
Absolutely.
whatever
Whenever
pragmatically gets to the
exactly.
end goal of alleviating
Yeah.
suffering in patients is great. So
Yeah.
we should take it.
Absolutely. So, but now this vagus nerve stimulation, and you point to another type of therapy, like start, I guess, with this electroconvulsive therapy. And it's not maybe not so surprising that if we know about how neurons work, they work as like electrochemical electrochemical machine.
Yeah.
So it can affect it both by with electricity and chemistry. So that's somehow electro electrotherapy or electro like stimulation,
Hmm.
electroconvulsive, I guess, and therapy that could have an effect, whether positive or negative is not so surprising. With this, how did that come about?
Yeah, just to get the terms laid out
Yeah.
there too. So electroconvulsive therapy is a very specific form of the therapy that dates back a very long time, and we can talk about how that
Mm,
developed. And it really is about inducing a seizure in the brain,
mm,
either chemically or via electrical kind of stimulation. There are other forms of brain stimulation that can happen either invasively by lowering electrodes into the brain or non invasively, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or somewhat invasively, like stimulating the vagus nerve either through the
mm.
skin or putting a cuff around it. So there's a whole class of therapies of this type. The original therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, dates back a really long time. So before the antipsychotics and the antidepressants, where a physician reasoned that based on so we all know that in the brain there are the brain cells that we usually call neurons, right? So those are the ones that electrically communicate with one another, and then there are these support cells called glia, which kind of help the neurons thrive. And exactly what the glia do, I think, is a really interesting contemporary conversation that we're all having. But loosely, that's been the history across history. The glia cells are there to kind of
Mm,
support the neurons. And yeah, so what they determined is anatomically in the brains of individuals with epilepsy, there were two. I think it was I was. It went one way. I think it was too many of the glia, and in the brains of individuals with schizophrenia, there were too few. And so they then reasoned that these two diseases might be at odds with one another. And so, in order to treat schizophrenia, what you want to do is something epilepsy like, and that is induce a seizure. That was the rationale. And so, they began by inducing these chemically in individuals. And for some individuals, it turned out to be highly effective. This was what was called electroconvulsive therapy. It then was transformed into electrical stimulation instead of chemical induction of a seizure. And
mm,
today, it went through a period of it was effective before antipsychotics existed, and so it was
yeah.
used. It went through a very controversial period. So if you've ever read the Casey book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? It was
Yeah.
actually used
The movie
punitively.
by with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
back
So
in the
it's used
days.
punitively, but today it's used. It's still used. It's a highly effective treatment. It's not a first line treatment, so it's used for individuals with depression and psychosis that can't be treated in other ways, like drugs. But it can be highly effective in some of those individuals when other treatments fall short. So
Mm.
that's one form of brain
And now
stimulation.
I guess now with a more focused and well thought out or more controlled and therapy is sort of like deep brain stimulation for Parkinson and movement disorders. That's also about sending in currents, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. So Parkinson's is the degeneration of dopamine neurons that produce dopamine in the brain, and it's not clear exactly why those neurons degenerate, but that's what's happening. The first line of treatment for Parkinson's is actually delivering dopamine to the brain, so levodopa,
Mm,
which is given. It's not dopamine, but it's a drug that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and
mm,
then it's transformed into dopamine. So it's a precursor to dopamine. But at some point, that drug also tends to not work as well as it originally did. It's not exactly clear why. It might be
mm,
because there's just too much degeneration happening in the brain, or it might be that the body's just becoming resistant to it. And if you give too much, it can cause side effects
yeah. No,
like
my
shaky.
father had Parkinson's, so I know
Yeah,
about this.
that's really
Yeah.
tricky. And so levodopa can then be complemented with, in some cases, deep brain stimulation, which, yes,
Mm,
is the surgical implantation of electrodes into sometimes the subthalamic nucleus.
mm,
And yeah, the development of that is interesting. So in the 1980s, there was a surgeon. So in the 1980s, the treatment for Parkinson's was the surgical removal of some of these deep brain areas like the subthalamic nucleus, but they would always lower an electrode during the surgery and try to stimulate it to see what the effects would be, to see if that would be effective before cutting out the brain. The problem with that is that once you remove a part of the brain, right, it's irreversible. And so
Uh,
if it has a bad
uh,
outcome, there's really nothing that can be done about it. So a French surgeon was trying to stimulate part of the brain as part of the surgery and turned up the stimulation to a higher frequency than typical. And so that had the effect of, instead of stimulating, it actually inhibited this part of the brain and mitigated the symptoms. And so that kind of keyed the surgeon on, oh, actually, we could lower electrodes into the brain,
mm,
stimulate at high frequencies, which then actually would inhibit shaky movements. And this is a very, the basal ganglia circuit is this very complicated, if you've ever studied, it's fascinating for anybody who ever wants to study it, but it's this complicated set of nuclei, some of which are inhibitory, some of which are
uh,
excitatory with lots of feedback loops. So
mm,
it's hard to explain very quickly. But so yeah, so with that in mind, then there was a non-human primate model of deep brain stimulation created, and then it was developed, and then went through
yeah.
clinical trials, and
Mm.
now it's
And
it's
now,
used
and
in a lot of
now,
patients.
of course, we have like maybe people I've heard about. Most people this Neuralink, with like a brain-computer interface, but
Hmm.
this has actually a quite long history in, or at least some decades old history of sort of actually, like I think you mentioned brain gate.
Yes, absolutely. I tell the story of Brain Gate, which is just this remarkable story. So these are brain machine interfaces. The long term goal is to treat many things, but right now one of the big focuses is on paralysis.
Mm,
So either due to spinal cord damage in some cases, or due to degenerative conditions. So trying to recover movement in individuals who can't move. And the discovery of BrainGate, it's just this beautiful convergence of information about how the brain is organized. So, for example, there was one individual who had damage and could not write letters, or even, and so the goal for this individual, so they could communicate again, was to imagine writing letters with their
mm.
hand, and those letters would then appear on a computer screen so they could actually communicate again. It's just this
Yeah.
really
So then
beautiful
they had
story.
electrodes inserted in the right part of the brain,
Exactly,
right?
for handwriting, they had to
Yeah.
find that. So we
Right.
have to
Yeah.
figure out what the parts of the brain, those, luckily, those brain areas still have residual signals, even
Yeah.
though you can't use your hand anymore. So the other
Mm,
things don't take over those parts of the brain.
yeah.
There's still those signals. But yeah, the convergence of what needs to happen to make something that like that work. So you
Mm,
have all the neuroscience, but you also have all the technology, right? You have to get
mm,
electrodes into a human brain stably. They can't float around too much, right? Because you need kind of consistent signals, even though you can do a little top up on the training. You have to figure out how to decipher those signals from the
mm,
brain. What do they mean? And how do we convert, patterns of brain activity into handwriting? You also, you need to get that information out of the head and onto the hard drive, right? So
mm,
how do we do that? And all this has to happen in a way that doesn't overheat the brain, right? These are electronics,
mm.
so it's this
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful
So I guess
convergence of all these things.
this brain gate story is sort of, like roughly 20 years old or something, or something like that. But yeah, order of, I mean, at least the
Yeah,
last yeah,
decades. Yeah. Hmm.
decades. But now I guess the main thing with Neuralink is that it's going to be like a wireless technology, and maybe more mass produced, and so that it's going to be, yeah, more convenient maybe for the patients, and maybe that like is at the price, eventually at the price that can actually make it sort of a viable alternative for many.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been one of the big impediments to pushing forward this technology, is just like the investment. Who's going to invest all of the money
Mm,
to develop it? And yeah, it's to see. And you're right. Neuralink is pushing forward on the technology end of the whole enterprise for sure. Yeah,
mm.
yeah. And I think
Okay,
most
so
are grateful for that. Yeah,
there
yeah.
are, okay, so now okay, so it's not all black. We have some examples of
Hmm.
where actually
Hmm.
science have, sometimes we've been lucky, and sometimes science have actually helped us to develop treatments. But as you say, it's still far away from like both understanding and treating the most, for example, most prevalent psychiatric disorders, and also like neurodevelopmental disorders. So now we're changing gear here to what to do next. And you have this question: have we done something wrong? Is the neuroscience of today focusing mainly on the right things? And
Hmm.
we have this nice analogy of brick production that I liked.
Hmm. Oh, yes, Chaos in the Brickyard.
Yeah.
So, Chaos in the Brickyard is this wonderful parable. It's a short little science piece. I think it's from the 1960s. And so, Chaos in the Brickyard likens the scientific enterprise to building these large, imposing edifices, these buildings,
Mm,
and the facts that we collect in our experiments to bricks. And it begins, once upon a time, scientists commissioned bespoke bricks as needed to build these strong edifices. And then we transitioned into a period in which we built up stacks of bricks with great pride. So, collected all these facts,
mm,
sometimes at the cost of building the edifices, because we couldn't even find the right bricks in the big mess. And then the parable ends. Saddest of all, sometimes there was no attempt to make a distinction between a
mm.
pile of bricks and a true edifice.
Yeah.
So yeah, to me, the take home message of Chaos in the Brickyard is we can get excited about technology, we can get excited about our facts and the
Mm,
accumulation of our facts, but we really have to think like, what are the blueprints for our buildings?
mm,
What are we planning to do all of those? Because those two things matter. We don't just want facts, right? We also want to
mm,
figure out how do we tie all those facts together. What are the
mm,
blueprints?
mm. Because one interesting thing I think in physics, where I come from, you have examples of actually this when you build like the accelerator in CERN, for example. You're in Switzerland
Hmm.
now, right? And we're actually dedicated to finding the Higgs boson, which is this
Hmm.
missing piece of the standard model of particle physics. So
Yeah,
there you really order a very bespoke piece of brick, right? The particle
absolutely.
accelerator, right?
Huge investment in finding that
Yeah,
brick. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
really starting with a yeah. So it's like the in physics there's like a yeah it's like if you have a strong, if you have a well developed theory, or a theory you have some faith in,
Hmm.
then sort of you more actually sort of can be motivated to actually do an experiment, even
Hmm.
expensive, if to test this particular theory, right?
Absolutely.
And
And
yeah.
the maybe the overtrodden, but I still think it's a really great example is planetary motion, right?
Mhm.
So we have go back to ancient Greece and we have Ptolemy and his model of how the planets and the sun all revolve around the Earth. And it was good. It was a good prediction of what would happen, where the planets would be at any one time. But it also had these hacks, like Mercury had to go this way and then go this way, then go this way again. And it wasn't really
Yeah.
clear what those epicycles were about. So Copernicus comes along and says, like, perhaps there could be a more reasonable arrangement. I think that's a little bit fishy.
Mm,
And what if we took all of the planets and revolved them around the sun, including the Earth, right?
mm,
And that shift from thinking about what planetary motion might be like really was a key to unlocking tremendous progress.
mm,
It inspired Kepler to build a model based on Brahe's measurements, which inspired Newton to wonder, why do the planets revolve around the sun in that way? And that was part of his formulation of gravity, which is still, Newton's laws are still very useful today, and we all learn them in
mm,
college and even in high school. And so when I think about brain research, I do think about us being in the middle of a transformation that maybe is something like that, in terms of we're stepping away from this very oversimplified domino chain way of thinking about the brain, which it's not wrong. It is predictive for some things, and for some systems it might even be a good approximation. But we're
mm.
beginning to think about the brain as something that might be like a different type of thing. And I think this is a really important and profound shift. And I think this will be the key to unlocking progress. That's why I'm so excited about it.
Because you're arguing for why we should focus more on thinking of the brain as a complex, so-called complex adaptive system, right? And I know, I
Hmm.
mean, complexity is sort of like, of course, many people are interested in complexity, different branches of science.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
what is to you a complex system? I think if you ask different people, they will get different definitions. But what is to you a
yeah.
complex system?
Absolutely. So yeah. So the bridging from the domino chain way of thinking about the brain to this kind of new emerging way of thinking about the brain, I think begins with the observation that the brain is full of not just causes that lead to effects, but also
Mm,
ones that feed back again as causes. So it's chock full of feedback loops at all levels. You see
mm,
this in the brain. So brain area A sends information to B, B sends information back to A again. You see this at level genetic networks, right, which aren't just these linear chains. There are lots of
mm,
complicated interactions. We're also agents that interact with our environments, right? So there's a big feedback loop between what's going on out there and what's going on, in our heads.
mm,
And when you have systems that have these big feedback loops, like first point out, they're dynamical, right? So you
mm,
have things that are time lagged. I think that that's an
mm,
important part of the complexity. These types of systems tend to have kind of surprising properties. I know this word emergence is
mm.
used in like to some to capture just like, oh, you can't
Yeah,
predict how
that's
the
also a
system
word
works
with
based on the parts in isolation because there are interactions
also a
between the
word with
parts.
many meanings around. Yeah.
It
Mm,
is. It is a but I think, just the point there, it's not magic, it's just you have interacting parts, often non-linearly. And so that's part of that's a complexity. So there's the dynamics in the system. There's complexity due to interactions between the parts that are really hard to just
mm,
infer or intuit. I think you often need models to try to figure this out. And then there's the adaptive bit. And the adaptive bit is really a reference to the fact that, that's the superpower of a brain is the ability to adapt to change. We are not stimulus
mm,
response machines.
yeah,
We are constantly learning and adapting to our environments in all sorts of incredible ways that we can talk about. But when I use that term, complex adaptive system, I know in slices of complexity, they want to really narrow in on like the special sauce of very special types of complexity. And it might be that, but I use that term in a more umbrella type of way, a system
mm,
that is both complex and it's adaptive,
yeah,
right?
I
And,
guess.
and,
Yeah.
and the reason I think it's so important to use that term, have a term that's more of an umbrella term, is we don't exactly know what types of things the brain is like yet, right? And so to say, oh, we're going to reserve these special terms, um, only once we figure out and have
Yeah,
proven and determined, are these self-organizing systems,
yeah,
and so on and
that's
so
true.
forth.
Mm,
We can have special terms for things. I think we just also need some of these umbrella terms as well.
that's
And for
true.
me, the important thing to distinguish is versus the domino chain, the completely feed forward type of way of thinking about the brain, versus one that's chock full of these feedback loops that gives it all sorts of interesting properties functionally, but also means that it's going to break in ways that can't be simplified to domino
Mm,
chains. I think that's the most important thing for
mm.
thinking about
Because I guess
dysfunction.
one thing, this thing about introducing terms, because I guess also that, for example, the term gene, which was introduced quite a long time ago, but like the meaning has sort of maybe developed over time. I think it was a useful term, something like the basic inheritable unit or something.
Yeah.
It was still useful, even though you might have to sort of to modify the use or whatever to define it more or in more properly or in more detail along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh,
I guess that's
communication. We could talk about that all day.
yeah.
I've as kind of a side note. So before I wrote Elusive Cures, I studied vision, I studied memory, I then zoomed out to study all sorts of things. And when I asked myself, what do I want to zoom back in on? I decided to zoom back in the space of emotion and mood. So
Mm,
this is a new field for me. And yes, I've been spending lots of time trying to wrap my head around all the different ways that term emotion is used. And there are
yeah,
big, fiery debates in the field about what
yeah,
is an emotion, right? What
yeah,
deserves the term emotion, and it's used so differently than some of the other brain functions.
yeah,
Words really matter; they
mm,
are really
yeah,
really important.
yeah,
But how do we simultaneously use them in ways that you and I can clearly communicate with one another with some precision, but
mm,
also communicate with others as well? So, in the case of emotion, one alternative is the term affective state, which nobody knows what an affective state, and certainly not a temporally extended affective state, right? If you put too much jargon on it, then you
yeah,
stop being able to communicate. So yeah, it's a
mm.
fascinating problem, right? Like how do we
Yeah, and I
define the
guess the
words we use?
earlier the less developed the field is, then the more like for example, I think like I'm just when I read a little bit psychology and like
Hmm.
things like personality and mind and it's like all this
Yeah.
what is mean? Yeah, it's all
These
these
are
different.
concepts, and
Uh,
I bet I intuit, but you can confirm
Uh,
for me. What a great way to get on the same page is to build some mathematical models,
I
right?
agree.
So if you
It
spell it
makes
out
it precise.
mathematically, then you know
Yeah,
exactly what you're
I
talking
agree.
about. And
Then
importantly, you can take two theories and you
mm,
can compare them, right? And you can
absolutely.
ask the question, are those theories actually mathematically equivalent or are they different?
Mm.
That's so crucial and I think so
I
important for to
Oh,
move a
well,
field
you're
forward.
you're preaching to the choir here, but
I thought so. I thought so.
this is exactly why I say we need mathematical models, not because mathematical models are necessarily right, but they typically aren't, but at least they are precise, so you can make some progress that way.
They're precise and so that's one benefit, right? We can actually change these word models into
Mm,
to something where we can compare them. And then the other benefit, when we especially when we talk about these complex adaptive systems with these
mm,
surprising emergent properties, is it's really hard to think through these systems. So in my book, I talk about this. I use an example of how researchers have approached a particular type of cancer, blood cancer, leukemia, and it's
mm.
controlled by a genetic network of 60 proteins that interact via 140 different connections. You can't look at that network and infer what's
No.
going on, right? But you can if you model it as a complex dynamical system
Mm,
and do model reduction. You can actually work your way through what are those different parts
mm.
of the
Yeah.
system doing. And I think going forward, that's going to
Mm,
be absolutely essential. And right now, you're what you just said. There are these swaths of the fields, particularly in the psychiatric space, that are the most complicated, arguably, parts of the brain and mind, and
absolutely.
yet they are the ones that have the least well-developed mathematical models, and I think that's
Mm,
essential that we change that. We
mm,
need to get some math over there in order to figure all
mm.
this out because it just can't be thought through. It can't.
Okay, so I mean, back to the a little bit about the terms because complex
Mhm.
is not the same as complicated. I guess a really
Mm.
long domino chain, maybe with branch points and stuff like that, that would be a complicated system, but not a complex system because it would be feed forward essentially.
Yeah.
And
Yes. And
that,
likewise, you can have something as simple as the logistic map equation, right? Which is
the map
incredibly
component,
simple equation with very complex
complex. Yeah.
behavior, right? It's actually a
So
chaotic system. So yeah,
hmm,
I agree. Complicated and complex are different
is
terms. How
yeah.
would you define these terms? How, what you also work in this
Well, I don't.
space?
Yeah,
Do you have
no, I
strong
think
opinions
it's.
about how to define the terms?
Well, I don't really have strong opinions. I'm sort of. I think it's. But I think, like, I guess the weather, which
Mm-hmm.
is sort of like the most. I mean, I'm really impressed by weather and the weather forecasters and what they do
Mm-hmm.
because it's really it's a non-linear interaction across many spatial and temporal scales. So that's certainly a complex system, and I think it's heartening that they have made so much progress on doing that. It seems that it's not. There are other systems which is very nonlinear and complex, where they
Mm-hmm.
have made more progress than the brain than in the
Mm-hmm.
brain. So I mean that's it's also a cause for optimism, I think. But I think I guess the weather is not a complex adaptive system because I don't think the molecules start changing in order to achieve something or whatever, right? So it's so I think in so I'm happy with your definition there.
The umbrella
So
definition. Yeah,
yeah.
okay. And on that note, I think that I just want to highlight the thing you just said is a really important thing.
Mm,
So if you look back, and I tell this story in Elusive Cures, the history of weather research, the end goal was not just prediction, the end goal was control. Right.
mm,
So when researchers set out to understand the weather, they actually wanted to control it. It was part of the motivation
mm,
behind developing the first generation of computers. Step one, prediction. Step two, control. They
mm,
wanted to control it not just to dissipate the paths of
mm.
hurricanes, which is great, but also they even wanted to weaponize the weather. The military was a
Yeah.
strong force behind this.
Uh,
And there were some there are some informative, I guess,
mm,
attempts to do that, including Project Cirrus, right, where they dumped a bunch of dry ice on a hurricane that was supposed to remain at sea out on the Atlantic off the coast of Georgia, and the worst possible thing happened. It did a hairpin turn and like
okay.
hit
Okay.
Georgia.
Yeah.
Fast forward, we learned that we shouldn't be messing around with the weather because the weather is chaotic. It's a system
Mm,
where these small perturbations can have these big, unpredictable effects. We gave up effectively trying to control the weather. And so there's a big question,
but we're
if the
quite good at
brain
we're quite good at changing the climate, though,
Well,
but that's
there's yeah,
unintentional. But
unintentionally,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But there's a big question there, right? It should
yeah,
what makes us think that the brain is going to be any different than the weather?
mm,
And
yeah,
this is an important question when it comes to brain disorders because really brain disorder treatment for a brain disorder is a form of control. You're trying to shift the
mm,
brain from an unhealthy state to a more healthy one, and that's a causal perturbation. It's a
mm,
type of benevolent control. I like to talk about it.
mm,
Um, so, what makes us think that the brain is going to be controllable? And part of it is what you just said there. The brain is not the weather, the brain is an adaptive system, and it has all these mechanisms in order to protect and adapt itself. For
mm,
example, when the brain breaks out into a seizure, those don't last forever, right? The brain has a way to kind of quell those.
mm,
Just like also often when we enter a depressive episode, we also can like escape it as well. So the brain has all these different ways, and I think conceptually that's I think a really important point for that we should all be having amongst our
mm,
community. How is it that we're going to find the brain's control nodes so we can
mm,
benevolently manipulate them in order and target them for treatments? And it depends a lot on the details, right, of the system we're working with. I think not the same thing is not going to work for depression. That's going to work for, say, paralysis or something else. But that conceptually thinking about the brain as a system where we have to find its control nodes in order to
mm.
create this end goal of treatments, I think is really, really important.
But I guess also, I mean, like well, controlling the weather sounds really don't well, at least on a long time scale, and also because of this the physical size of the
Yeah, so
globe.
there's the physics involved, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
so there's
also,
the yeah,
but I
yeah.
also think non-linearities that sort of make the weather being chaotic with
Mhm.
this butterfly effect and so on can
Mhm.
also act stabilizing, right? I mean, it's also that these non-linearities. I mean, when you, for example, when you talk about complex adaptive systems, like you do in the book, you talk about attractors that somehow
Mhm.
the system settles into a state,
Yep.
which is hopefully then a good state,
Mhm.
and then maybe the system has mechanisms to keep you in that state, maybe nonlinear mechanisms. So it's not only not only. I mean, so that's isn't that another way that nonlinearities can actually help us?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And we're actually starting to measure those attractor states in the brain for
yeah,
the first time in history, which is so exciting, right? And
yeah,
I think that's important as we talk about shifting away from thinking about the brain as a domino chain to
mm,
thinking about it as a complex adaptive system.
yeah.
For the first time in
Is that
history, we're
yeah?
actually able to really take this seriously because to study
Mm,
complex system and to study how its behavior emerges from interactions between its parts. You have to study the parts all at the same time, right? You can't
mm,
study them independently in
mm,
order to get something like understand that there's a line attractor or something or oscillator there. And for the first time, we're actually able to do that. So 20 years ago, when I was first recording from neurons in the brain, we could record from one or two neurons at a time. I remember it was very exciting when somebody could figure out a technology to record from five at the same time. Now we're
mm,
up to 1 million neurons in a mouse, right? It's just
mm,
this transformative technology. And so yeah, we're finding these attractor states all over the brain, and we're starting to crack open ways to measure things we've never been able to measure before, like emotion. So, David
mm.
Anderson at Caltech is doing these beautiful experiments in mice, measuring emotions like aggression as a line attractor in the
Ah.
hypothalamus, right?
So
He's able to do that.
now we're into these sort of like low dimensional manifolds, like this kind of analysis, maybe.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, right, and
So
so
that's kind
that's
of
just
technology,
unlocking
like
yep, that's
yeah. Mm,
technology, it's because they can record from so many neurons all at
mm.
once, yeah,
So
and they have ways to analyze the data as well, right, so it's not just about technology, it's also about, thinking through, what do you do with it? What do you do with that data? I think that's
yeah,
important.
because I think when it go back to like the modeling in the early 70s and well in the early visual system that you of course
Mhm,
know well, it was all about this essentially feed forward models making these different kind of receptive fields.
mhm,
And but now we're talking about another mathematical object or like attractors. So that's maybe while signal processing is more about like linear systems, maybe quasi-linear or whatever.
mhm,
Like
mhm.
well, we didn't really use attractor. We didn't talk about so much about attractor states, but when it comes to more like cognitive things, then attractor states is maybe the way to go.
It
or attractor thinking. Yeah.
yeah, it seems like that's part of, at least in this era,
Mm,
that's a big part of the emerging story. I mean, I'll confess that when I set out to write Elusive Cures,
mm,
I did not think I was writing a book about
mm.
complex adaptive systems.
Oh
I
no.
did this type of research actually before graduate school. I worked
Uh,
on a a model of quadrupedal locomotion, right, which
mm,
had basically four central pattern generators are all
mm.
connected together to
So like
and
four leg animals with
four-legged,
four
yeah,
legs. Yeah.
creature. And so I was supposed to find the initial conditions that would make
Yeah.
it walk and run and gallop and do all of these things.
Mm,
And I walked away from that experience thinking, this is just not a very useful way to think about a brain unless the brain is doing something like walking or breathing or something like that.
mm,
But I just, even as of 4 years ago, I saw a lot of the field converging on thinking about the brain this way, and I just didn't really get it. So when I set out to write Elusive Cures, I thought I was going to write a book about filling in the missing algorithmic level, right? So
I see.
drugs, target molecules, and there's this big missing piece. Like, how does increasing the level of a chemical at a synapse help us, say, pay attention in the case of
Mm,
Ritalin, right? So we got to fill in the algorithm, and I wrote that book and I realized, there's a big missing piece there. My CV up to this date
mm,
really is really about domino chains, measuring
mm,
the algorithm. The brain is an information processing machine that computes, but transformations from brain area A to brain area B. So what is brain area B doing to compute based on its inputs from brain area A?
mm,
And I realized, no, that we can't just apply that type of approach, even if we fill in the algorithm and try to understand brain dysfunction. There's a missing piece there. And the missing piece is those big feedback loops. So, yeah, I think our field,
so,
it's both an old way of thinking about the brain, where there are, vestiges of that go back to Norbert Wiener in the
mm,
1940s with his ideas about the body and the brain and control. So there's long been a way of thinking about the brain in this way, but it's just starting to catch fire. And I think we're just starting to wrap our heads around
mm,
how to do it and how to do it well and why it matters. I think for me,
mm.
that was the real key.
So then, I mean, if you think of then as a, well, just first as the brain as a complex system, maybe like
Hmm.
networks of neurons, for example, then because it's a complex system, it's practical to talk about them in terms of like attractors, maybe that you go between and maybe the adaptive part is actually that the attractor landscape changes over time or something, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I would say there are two steps, right? So there's the
mm,
step from thinking about, so now let's talk on neural networks, right? You have the
yeah,
feed forward kind of neural network. So there's the first step where
mm,
you add the feedback, but you still train it to do the thing it's supposed to be doing, right? And those weights are fixed. And so that would be like a well-trained recurrent neural network. So I would say that's
mm,
step one, add the feedback in. And then step two is a continuously learning machine, right?
mm,
Which the brain clearly is. And then that's another type of piece, right? So step
mm,
one has the attractor landscapes you're talking about, and step two has landscapes that are continuously changing, right? And
mm,
so I think, we're in the middle of starting to get step two kind of a little bit right. I think that's where most of the field is thinking right now. And then that step three, that's definitely the next adventure for the field. But it's so clearly relevant.
uh,
So, in this new field that I'm working in,
mm,
mood is clearly about kind of a running average of events, the goodness and
mm,
badness of things that are happening to us, which is
mm,
clearly, it's a continuous form of learning, right? That we're using in order to, adapt to changing conditions. And so we're going to need,
mm,
in order to understand depression, we need to, it's not just there are a bunch of, chaotic attractors and you get depressed when somehow your ball ends up in one. It's that the landscape is continuously changing and shifting. We're going to
mm,
have to wrap our heads around that. The concepts are
mm.
still, very
Well,
ill-formed, I think.
at least it helps to have this idea of I can think about the tractors and
Mhm,
attractor landscape, and you can
mhm.
think about the changing attractor landscape. At least it's sort of like something I can keep in my head while when you think about mathematical models or something.
Yeah.
So it's but when you sort of uh, what are sort of examples of like complex adaptive behavior? I think you mentioned like for
Mhm.
example this thing of homeostasis. What is homeostasis?
Yeah, so homeostasis is about, it goes back to Walter Cannon's book, A Wisdom of the Body. And the idea of homeostasis is about adapting to changing conditions. So Cannon will focus on things like when you exercise, your muscles create a lot of heat. And so your body has to do things like sweat to cool
Mm,
itself, right? So you have a system where the causes are leading to the effects that then are feeding back on
mm,
causes in order to adapt to these changing conditions. So you want to sweat to cool your body temperature. So that's homeostasis, is adapting to changing conditions. And there
mm.
is a related term called allostasis. So, allostasis is the idea that your body wants to not just adapt to what has changed, but
Mm.
wants to predict what's about to change and then
Yeah.
proactively adapt to it. Examples of that are our body. I was fascinated to learn that our bodies actually can. So our bodies, when we eat, release insulin, right, in order to deal with the blood sugar. But our bodies can learn to habitually release insulin at the times we usually eat our meals. And
Ah,
so that's kind of a allostasis version
ah.
of the idea.
Maybe well, I don't know, maybe contributing to making you feeling hungry at dinner time or
Yep,
something.
yep, and that's exactly, yeah, there's that too. Yeah, yeah. So you can feel
Mm,
hunger
mm,
because you have a change in
yeah,
things like blood sugar levels, or you can proactively, yeah,
yeah.
anticipate that. Yeah, yeah.
So okay, so that's
Mhm.
a whole body thing, and trying to
Mhm.
sort of keeping the body in an overall nice attractor state. And then it's another more like closer to home, or the brain. Uh, I mean, there's this idea of criticality in the brain, right? In
Yes.
especially cortical networks, that somehow you're close to the edge of going, that the brain goes epileptic, but you shouldn't get over it, obviously, because then you get epileptic seizures. So that also, can you think of that as an attractor state?
It's a good question,
Yeah.
and I would pit that one back to you to ask, like, is it the best way to think about this in a tractor state? But let's just make sure, yes, that everyone's on the same page with what the
Mhm.
idea of the critical brain is about. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward idea. So there's like the deep and profound physics behind criticality, right, which
Mm,
is kind of scale free phenomenology. But there's also just I think the 101, and that is anytime you have a system where if brain area A or part of the brain, a neuron, sends information to B and B sends information back to A again,
mm,
if all you have in that system is just excitation, you've created an amplifier, and that thing is just going to go into a seizure immediately.
mm,
So you have to balance excitation and inhibition. If you
mm.
get too much excitation in there, you're going to get a seizure. But if you get too much inhibition in there, you're going to get a coma, right? So you have a giant sensory input and it just pitters out a little
Yeah.
after going a little bit through the brain. So you have to get this balanced excitation and inhibition, and when you get that balance just right, then the sensory input will propagate through the brain in some sort of,
Mm,
maximally and
yeah.
formative way. And so that is the point of criticality, this
Mm,
balanced excitation and inhibition. And there are lots of discussions about, are there any parts of the brain that live at that point?
mm,
Um, and how would you measure it? I think that's the
yeah.
other what's the evidence for it? But that idea is leading us to new ways to measure things we've never been able to measure
Mm,
before.
yeah.
One example is this beautiful work from Keith Hengen and his team at at Washington University in St. Louis, where they've figured out ways to measure how close the brain is to this critical point,
Mm,
and they measure it around the clock in the brains of rats. And
mm,
they ask the question, why do we sleep? And the answer is throughout the rat day, the rat's brains deviate from this critical point, and then
mm.
sleep brings it back to them, brings it back
Ah,
again.
I see.
Even, and it's not just a circadian rhythm, because if across the day they fall off the critical point and they keep them up 90 minutes past their bedtime, they fall even further off the critical point, and again,
Oh,
sleep them brings them back. So this suggests that
yeah.
we have now a way to measure how sleep restored a brain is,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
At least
Yeah,
in
yeah.
some cases. And that's really exciting, because then that unlocks all sorts of opportunities, like to test the hypothesis that Alzheimer's disease, the degeneration, is really because a brain can't sleep restore itself, at least in part. And so
Mm,
imagine now we have a way to measure sleep restoration of the brain. these types of ideas are leading us to new measures. And so this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about the criticality hypothesis. Like we can talk about the science behind it and is it correct and how do we think about it, but it also can inspire these new ways to measure things, right?
Mm.
Is it thought of as, so now that we've laid that out
Yeah.
in terms of something that's dynamically changing across the day and is restored in
Mm.
sleep, I think that is of the three different models we've just talked about. So there's the domino chain, then
Mm.
there's the fixed recurrent neural network that's well trained, and then there's the changing landscape. And I think we want to think about this as a changing landscape type of
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
changing across the day.
Yeah.
But I don't know. How would you think about that? You,
No, I think
as a
that I
physicist.
guess you can sort of think of these as, it depends on what you mean. Yeah, I guess that, I mean, if in some sense when, well, a tractor is maybe, if it had sort of come back to your, say, if you return to this critical point or close to the critical point
Mhm.
in a matter of seconds, then you would think of it clearly as an attractor. But if it's like a day, then maybe it's more like a changing landscape. I guess that's also a question about the time scale of returning to yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah,
And so
I,
so
I
yeah,
guess
and
you can
just
call
to
death is an attractor on a 100-year time scale, right?
so yeah,
I
so
would, that's
just
not
to make
very
sure,
useful. Yeah,
making sure that all the listeners are really like getting the
yeah,
concepts. Yeah, so you can perturb one of these reciprocally coupled networks. You can perturb where it is based on an external perturbation, which might
yeah,
be noise or just an external perturbation. So that could be the reason that the network is falling off because there's some sort of external thing that's changing across the day, or it could be that the network is like the landscape is changing insofar as it is a network of neurons that are connected together. It could be that the
mm,
synapses themselves are
yeah.
changing or properties
So,
of the neurons are changing,
yeah,
right? So, what's the right way to think about all of these things? I think conceptual clarity of the hypothesis space,
mm.
right, is really important. Again, mathematical models are
Yeah,
really, really
exactly.
helpful. Let's get some mathematical models. Let's talk about
So,
when these things can actually be distinguished. What is the experiment that would distinguish them? And let's
mm,
go in and do that experiment,
yeah,
right?
and
That's
maybe
the
it
path
sort of
forward.
is almost like it depends on that actually the difference between like thinking about this attractor in the fixed landscape and sort of at the well and taking into account this sort of like changing landscape. It maybe in the mathematical theory, complete mathematical theory, it would maybe be mainly about the time scales of things,
Hmm.
and so then it would be clearer. But now we just had to there's no right and wrong here. I think like absolute right and wrong here. I think when you talk about these things, at least in that you need make some additional definitions yeah, that for
All
example
models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah, all
that's also
models are wrong.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So like we're refining, right?
yeah,
And trying to
absolutely.
capture the phenomenon of interest. Yeah.
So how does this sort of thinking? I mean, is it like there's all these philosophical discussions, or like use of reductionism versus
Mm.
emergence, and
Hmm.
bottom up versus top down, and how does the complex adaptive system thinking fit into this?
Yeah, these are words that are used in a lot of different ways,
Yeah.
right? And it feels to me that none of the it's not a black and white world. It's
Mm.
always gray. So reductionism can mean a lot of different things. I like to think about it the way that Eric Kandel, the Nobel laureate, defined it, because I think he has the most successful implementation of reductionism, right,
Mm.
in the past century. And so,
And
what
what
did Kendall?
just briefly to the listeners, what did he worked on the memory of a very simple
Yes,
animal.
yes.
Mm.
So he worked out the molecular mechanisms supporting memory first in sea slugs and then in mice. And that kind of set the stage for our ability today to manipulate memories in mice, where we can implant them and erase them
Yeah.
and do all sorts of really exciting things with
Mm.
them.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, so the way Kandel thought about methodological reductionism is approaching the system by studying its parts first in isolation, and then studying how those parts interact. Right? He really thought about that as part of the whole agenda. And so it's not then that reductionism and emergence are necessarily at odds with one another, because in these definitions of emergence, where it's really just the surprising properties that happen when the parts interact, right? If you study the parts independently and then you study their interactions, then you'll get the emergent properties. The issue with reductionism is that when you have lots of parts, like 86 billion neurons in a brain, it
Mm.
just becomes infeasible to study, how all of the different parts interact together, and then from that infer kind of the emergent behaviors. And so that's where reductionism, this kind of bottom up type of approach, is often pitted against the more top down approach. So there you do things like you specify the phenomenon of interest. I want to understand mood. I want to understand depression. And then you try to infer the underlying mechanisms that give rise to this phenomenon. At the same time, I think it's really important to say, well, that's not a magic bullet either. You can't just say, I want to understand depression holistically.
Mm.
I'm going to assume it's an emergent property, and then
Uh,
but what's next, right? So to some extent, then you do have to get into a more, well, let me go in and see what the parts are and how they're interacting. Um, so yeah, I don't think it's a black and white world in any of these things. I think
mm.
it's also important to keep in mind, we are a community of researchers, and if we approach things in a diversity of ways, we will, together we'll get there. But when you do shift away from thinking about the brain as a domino chain and acknowledge that really interacting parts are going to matter, it does have some important implications for things like you have to study all the parts at the same time. You can't study them independently in order to
Mm.
figure out, these properties. And so that's where some of that comes in. How do you think about these terms, emergence,
Well, no,
reductionism, top
I
down,
think
bottom up?
it's, yeah, I come from, as I said, from physics, and my favorite theory is statistical physics,
Hmm.
which show how you can actually describe a box of gas molecules using either Newton's laws for each molecule, or you can sort of describe it at that level of thermodynamics with
Hmm.
pressure and volume and temperature. And a
Hmm.
term like temperature doesn't exist on the level of a single molecule. So no, and of course the statistical physics and Boltzmann and Maxwell showed
Hmm.
how these were linked. So for me, this is sort of clearly sort of what's called I think what's called a weak emergence. That
Hmm.
is like it's more practical to describe systems at
Hmm.
gases at the macroscopic level in terms of thermodynamics, pressure, temperature, and so on. But it doesn't. It's not like anything. Everything could, in principle, be found by simulating like the Newtonian dynamics of all these
Hmm.
molecules. It's just that it's very impractical or impossible in practice.
Hmm.
So for me, but there's no magic in there. It's not like so, and I think that's
That's an important
also the
component. Yeah.
case here. There's not like
Hmm.
any. My starting point is that not like any magic potion coming up at the higher levels. It's just, of course, things are much more. It's a more clear separation of scales in this, for
Hmm.
example, the gases. So things are much easier. So it's a question of whether this sort of. But
Hmm.
I don't think. I don't think. Well, I don't think we disagree on this.
Yeah, and on that, building on the analogy a little bit, one of the things that's very different about a brain, or maybe it isn't, is the
Mm,
heterogeneity of its bits,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Which in the gases, you get a bunch of copies of kind of the same molecule or something
yeah.
that has kind of very similar properties.
Mm.
But how do you think about that? I know you've done a lot
Uh,
of kind of mean field modeling and that sort of thing,
yeah, no,
right? Yeah.
that's true. Of course,
Hmm.
also that in actually, if you take a gas molecules, oxygen molecules,
Hmm.
and substitute half of them with nitrogen, nothing happens in terms of pressure and temperature, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so their
Kind of.
heterogeneity doesn't really matter.
Hmm.
So that's of course the $1,000 question: what does really the heterogeneity of
Hmm.
the neurons within sort of a same class? Does it really matter? When does it matter? So this is this. I don't think you have to check and
Yeah.
see
Yeah. So it's an
where.
empirical question then. Yeah.
It's a
It's
perfect
really, yeah.
question,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's
So
fair enough. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
let's, I mean, maybe it's one of these. So I think this statistical physics approach, which I think many,
Hmm.
at least people from physics, they bring with them this hope that is you can do something like this. And of course, maybe the hope, maybe it's more just as futile and hoping for
Hmm.
like a help from molecular biology or brain imaging alone. But now, anyway, so this is something we just have to explore. That's one of these things we have to
Yeah,
explore in the
I like
future,
that
I think.
idea, and I also, building on something that we said earlier, the idea that there are different, a couple different types of things in the brain, right? One is these kind of early sensory areas that
Um,
they're largely kind of domino chainy. There's a little bit of
yeah,
feedback there, but then you get these other more cognitive areas, and those are just ones in which they just you need things like attractor states and things in
yeah.
order to explain what
But
they
yeah,
are. But maybe there are kind of modular ways of thinking about
that's
these
true.
different brain
But I
areas,
think,
or along a spectrum
yeah.
between two things or something, right? Yeah.
But I think the point is that if you sort of make really like a model that both includes the early sensory systems
Hmm.
and there's more like deeper into the brain, that in terms of the mathematical models, you could have sort of like some like gradient or changes from this more domino like in the beginning to more attractor in the end, and it
Hmm.
would be not like a clear distinction. But when you have this mathematical model that hopefully then can explain the experiments,
Hmm.
then after you have that mathematical model, then you can sort of start thinking about it in attractor states. And I mean, I used to yeah, and so then you make these simpler mental models, and I think that's I mean, this is I used to do solving the Schrödinger equation in quantum physics
Mhm.
before
Mhm.
I ventured into this. And then,
Mhm.
of course, we had the Schrödinger equation that you use to compute things. But
Mhm.
then, in order to have mental images of this, maybe to come up with new ideas, I
Mhm.
sometimes thought of it as a wave and sometimes as a particle. And you have to be, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
But
some
the ground truth
flexibility.
is really
Mhm.
mathematics, right? So
Mhm.
so I think that's like two different things in some
Mhm.
sense.
Mhm. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, because I've been thinking of, I mean, weather forecasts now are done only on computers, right? It's
Mhm.
essentially just model. But still, sort of, if you look at weather forecasts, there's on TV, they still talk about low pressures here and high pressures there, right? In some sense,
Mhm.
they could have just presented the weather map and say, oh, that's what the model gives. But
Yeah.
you do more than that, right?
Yeah, they do a little bit of why behind it. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So, and I
Mhm.
guess, and even though these concepts are approximate, still it sort of has, yeah, still has some merit and helps you to think about it and maybe,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm. Yes, we
okay.
definitely. I think there's a phenomenon like that too. At least for me, I think it's pretty common, right? When the doctor prescribes me a medicine for something, it doesn't matter how the medicine works, right? It's
Mm,
going to work or it's not going to work. Like me
yeah,
knowing how it works has very little to do with its effectiveness, one would think, right? But I still want to know how it works, right? I still
yeah,
want to know its mechanism of action, and so
yeah. But I think
um,
maybe
there's a
because you're
desire
a
to
scientist, maybe because
maybe.
this is actually when I came to my I had a
Mhm.
doctor that I had for 30 years or something, and when I came with an issue, he's always tried to give a like a scientific explanation. I wonder if some of it was just placebo, that it wasn't really, but that was
That's an
like
important thing. Yeah, yeah.
placebo for scientists. That's some kind of scientific explanations that make
And
sense.
that's what's
Right?
different than the weather, right? Yeah. So even if you know what's causing the weather or you don't, it's going to have no
Yeah,
impact
you
on the
cannot
weather. There's no
go like
placebo effect with the weather,
that's
right?
true.
Yeah. But there
But
is
nevertheless,
absolutely with
yeah,
medication on the body.
good.
That's a good point.
But one thing you say in your book is that complex systems are brittle.
Hmm.
What do you mean by that? Or why are they
Yeah.
brittle?
Yeah, this is the kind of the concept that when you have an adaptive system, that
Mm,
also makes it fragile in other ways. And so,
mm,
one example of that is like our fight or flight system. So, if we see a
mm,
tiger, right, that's going to
mm,
trigger our bodies to move into a whole different regime, which releases adrenaline and cortisol, gears our bodies up to run.
mm,
And that's great. Like, that's an adaptation, and that's a really good thing. We're not going to be so good at doing math during that time, but that's okay, right?
mm,
Because
mm.
that's not the
Can do
point.
that later. Mm,
Yeah, yeah. But those chemicals can also kind of burn the system out. For example, chronic stress can lead to insomnia, right? The
mm,
inability to sleep, which then in turn leads to an inability of our bodies to heal themselves. It can actually cause damage, like structural damage to the hippocampus, which is one of our centers of our cognitive
mm,
functions. And so here's an example of a system that has these interdependencies, right? So it has this adaptivity that's enabled by these chemicals and these different shifts in states. But
mm,
because we have these interdependencies between all of these systems, that adaptability comes at the price of fragility
mm.
in other ways. Another great
Mm.
example of that, I think, is our immune
So
system.
meaning that you can adapt yourself into a bad state in some sense.
Yeah, yeah, adaptability, there's no free lunch here, right?
No.
Yes. And
So
so I
you
think
can,
it does take on different conceptual forms in terms of what types of fragilities are follow from that adaptability. Just another conceptual form would be uh, it's distinct, but I think it's important to think about as well. So our learning systems, right? We have things, mechanisms to increase synaptic weights, long-term potentiation or synaptic strengthening. We also have mechanisms to decrease synaptic weights, right? So Hebbian versus anti-Hebbian learning.
mm,
To have this second mechanism, so the whole thing makes the system work, right? Because it can go
yeah,
not just in one direction, but two. But when you add this second set of mechanisms, you have a whole additional set of things that can go wrong in your system. And Fragile X is a mutation in the gene for one of these long
oh,
term
yeah,
depression mechanisms.
yeah.
So that's another form. Another example would be our immune system. So our immune system is just this exquisitely, awesomely, incredibly tuned
Yeah.
system that can
Yeah.
hunt out little pathogens in our bodies. So that thing is really living at some sort of knife edge in order to be able to
Mm,
do that. And if it gets just a little bit too overactive, that causes a neuroimmune attack, where immune systems actually attack our bodies and cause things like multiple sclerosis. But the solution for that isn't to turn the immune system off, because we'll die, right? So
mm,
so these are things where this adaptability does come at the price of a certain
mm,
amount of fragility, and I use that in this very broad sense of
mm.
the more complicated things that are happening, the more things can go wrong as well, right? Yeah, and
Because
it's
I
due
think
to interdependencies of all of these
mm,
systems on one another.
I think you mentioned, for example, that depression can be sort of understood as as a complex adaptive system,
Yes,
or
yes,
yeah, or
absolutely.
a
So.
state in a
Mhm.
complex adaptive system. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways of thinking about it. The first thing we have to think about, yeah, is just what is mood? So
Yeah. Well,
mood,
now you're an expert, right? We have,
yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's one of
yeah,
the big
yeah,
mysteries up there with consciousness.
yeah.
Um, one thing that differentiates mood from other emotions is that emotions are thought to be triggered by individual things, right? So see a
Mm,
tiger and you're afraid. If you see feces, you might get disgusted, but moods tend to be more diffuse. They're not, we can't always
mm,
point to the thing that makes
mm,
us triggers a good or a bad mood. And all of the evidence suggests is because moods are an integration across
mm.
multiple events. They're not a triggered by a single event. So it's
Exactly.
not tiger emotion. It's an
So like
integration
the
across multiple events.
relationship between climate and weather in some sense.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, that's one of versions of the DSM says exactly that.
Okay.
Emotions are like the weather and moods are like the climate.
Ah,
That's literally what it
yeah.
says. Yeah, it's an early
Okay.
version of the DSM. You got it.
Mm,
Um, and so moods are an integration over multiple experiences, but it's also the case that moods bias us to interpret the things that are happening to us in a different
yeah.
way. So,
Mm,
given a particular thing that might happen to us, if we're in a good mood, we will perceive it as better than it actually is, and if we're in a bad mood, we'll perceive it as worse. So, you have this reciprocal system where our moods are the integration of many different experiences,
yeah.
but really our interpretation of those experiences. So, our moods determine how we interpret what happens to us, but that in turn determines our moods. So here you
Mm,
have a system that's pretty fragile, right? So if you have, a certain number of bad things happen to you, this system could spiral downward into depression.
yeah.
If you have good things happen to you, it can spiral upward into some sort of
Exactly.
mania, right? So there must be all these protective mechanisms that are keeping mood from spiraling out of control in that way. And I think that's one really important component of mood. But if
Mm,
you can ask then, well, why would we have such a system? It seems like a bug, not a feature, right?
mm,
And there's some really interesting ideas about what mood is. My Some of my favorite ideas are from the lab of Yael Neve at Princeton and colleagues who think about mood as an ongoing running average of goodness and badness, because that just
mm,
seems to be what it is. And so you could say, why might you want that?
yeah.
And they have some really nice theories about how this manifests for reinforcement learning, so reward
Mm,
based learning.
mm,
And it's pretty intuitive. So the idea is that reward based learning works really, really well when the conditions are stable. So imagine you're a monkey and you're trying to find fruit in a tree, right? And you're trying to figure out which trees have the best fruit. If you visit those and you just get your rewards, right, you're going to learn that. But if it's the spring and all the fruit is increasing, or it's the fall and all the fruit is decreasing, and it takes you time to go from tree to tree, you are not going to get the answer right in terms of which tree actually has the best fruit, because you're going to confuse this global change with the local one. And so this running average you can use that to correct your reward-based learning algorithms by taking that change into account.
Okay.
So that's the gist, the theoretical gist behind why we have mood. It tells us something about how our environment is changing, which then can help us interpret, learn, and when it's an adaptive thing, right? So it's there to help us learn when the conditions are changing. That's the idea behind mood.
Yeah. Cool. So now I think in your book you mentioned a few challenges. Now, if we accept this brain as a complex adaptive system picture, and so there's a few challenges. So I thought we could just go through them briefly. And I guess the first challenge is how to measure behavior of brains or of brain when considered complex adaptive systems, right? I mean, you need, for example, I think you mentioned how to quantify depression.
Yes.
For example,
Yeah. So there is this kind of fascinating interaction between measurement and understanding, right? So we presumably, if we know how a system works, we know exactly how to measure it. But we need measurements to create understanding, and we need understanding to create measurements, right? So how do we even begin? And there's a wonderful description of how we solved that problem for temperature back in the 16th century. It's a book written by Hasuk Chang called Inventing Temperature. And I highly recommend reading this book. It's a great historical account. In the case of temperature, we kind of, let me just, before I get there, to say how we did it for temperature. Hasuk Chang's proposal is that the way scientists make progress is through what he calls epistemic iteration. So it's iterating on what we know. The idea is that we won't know how to measure something until we understand it, but what you have to do is just jump in with your best guess. So in the case of temperature, we began by creating the thermometer, but a key part of creating the thermometer was standardization, right? So you have a bunch of thermometers and they're all measuring the same thing. So we had to decide on a temperature scale. And there was a lot to work through in that period, including things like temperature depends on atmospheric pressure and also the container that you're boiling your water in and so on. And so a key to temperature measurement was standardization. In the case of depression, it's really interesting. So we have actually 250 scales to measure depression, and they're all similar in type insofar as they ask questions like, are you sad? And have you been sleeping? And have you been eating? And have you been crying? So they're based on symptoms, but there are 250 different versions of this. The one scale that's used most extensively in depression measurement dates back to the 1960s. It's called the HRSD scale. And as some researchers like Eiko Fried point out, since the 1960s, we've gone to the moon. We have these wonderful computers in our pockets now, right? We're still using this 1960 scale. So obviously we haven't iterated much on that measurement. At the same time, while that is a scale that is used quite extensively, it's also the case that not all researchers are using the same scale. And there are these 250 different versions of it. So the equivalent of the temperature standardization committee that meant back in the 16th century for temperature to create the thermometer, that meant in 2019 for depression research, which is a great step forward. But the take-home message here is we have this tension between two things. On one hand, we want some standardization, so we all do have the same thermometer for depression. On the other hand, we also want to be open to iterating on that measurement because we have to come out of the gate assuming that we don't have the right measurement yet, because in order, and then we should refine as we go forward. And so that's the tension, I think, in any field. I'll stick my own neck out as a brain researcher, and as I think about getting into mood research, and say, I don't think the next big breakthrough in depression research is going to be the 251st scale for depression,
No,
right? Like we're
no.
going to have to, and I think the big breakthrough of this era is going to be what's happening in here. We're finally going to figure out how to measure emotions and
That's true.
moods in the brain, and that's going to be the key to unlocking progress that then will help us iterate into an
Mm.
understanding.
But I guess
Yeah.
also if you look back at physics and temperature, I mean, there was
Hmm.
this meeting conference in Paris in 1875 where they
Yes.
actually decide these things, right? So now in science we all talk about, well, Celsius, right, or
Hmm.
Kelvin in physics. So even though you use Fahrenheit, like for daily use in US, that's sort of as yeah. So
Yeah, no,
so you
and
need,
in
yeah,
that history, it was great. Somebody suggested we should standardize to the melting point of butter, right? Like
really.
the
Oh
suggestions
well.
out there were pretty crazy,
Well, I think,
that
but I
were
mean,
going on.
here in
Hmm.
Norway, we had like length units related to the arm of the king
Yeah,
for
there
a
you
while.
go.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So when the king changed and they got the long-armed king, then
that's a
yeah,
problem, right? When you're
that's a
thinking
problem.
kings.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So we,
relatively
so
stable.
we. Anyway, so
Hmm.
but I mean, I guess this need to standardize and quantify like these complex adaptive systems is.
Hmm.
I mean, you would like to have as whether you believe in the domino effect or the complex adaptive system, you would still like to have standardized measurements to do science. But I guess it's maybe
Absolutely.
even more pertinent if you sort of want to do more precise modeling of them.
Yes, you need, yeah, for more precise modeling. And again, if
Yeah.
you, insofar as kind of the idea of standardization is we want to create these big
Mm,
databases like they have
mm,
for protein folding, right, where we can all kind of access the data in this era of big data, and we actually kind of have sense of what to do with data
mm,
like that. We want to fit models to it. It is important if we're dealing with complex adaptive systems that all of those measurements were made at the same time to the degree to
mm,
which that's possible, right? So we don't just want um, uh, single measurements from a whole lot of people made independently. We want to
mm.
take individuals and measure as many things
Sure.
as we can
Yeah.
about that individual, including their genes and their brain activity and their life history and so on and so
Mm,
forth. So we can actually
mm,
fit these interactions between those terms. There
mm,
was this fascinating report that over a swath of many years in depression research, up to recent history, if you just do a meta analysis of the papers, 93% of all papers about depression research are focusing on one factor that causally influences depression, right? So they're measuring
okay.
one thing across many
Yeah.
individuals. Only 7% are looking at interactions between those different things. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think we really have to shift to
Mm,
rethinking how we do science and prioritize a certain type of measurement in
mm.
order to push forward, just conceptually.
Yeah. So, okay, it's challenge one, how to measure behavior and
Hmm.
brain complex adaptive system. Challenge two is sort of how to understand or whatever predict such system in
Hmm.
practice.
Hmm.
And there's no because there's no because actually if you go to the bottom of physics, the basic laws of physics, there's no causal structure. You cannot really say that X causes Y. It's just everything happened at the same time, and they follow these mathematical laws. So
Hmm.
there's no sort of clear causal structure. So you cannot. And I think I guess in brain research, which is of course
Hmm.
at a higher more coarse grained level, you typically have been saying that, well, finding
Causes.
explanation
Yeah.
X causes Y. But
Hmm.
that is maybe a problem when you think of it as a complex adaptive system.
Yes, yes. When you're thinking about a domino chain, the
Mm,
causes lead to effects, right? In this really
mm,
clear way. And yeah, when you think about time delayed feedback loops,
mm,
the kind of your notions of causality break down, right? And correlation and causation. And for both, it gets more complicated, but I think it's also important to point out that it also gives you a whole new set of tools, right? The types of tools they use in ecology, where they really leverage the fact that
mm,
these systems have these interesting
mm,
properties. So yeah, I think there are two sides to that coin. But
mm,
yes, there are kind of two concepts of causality that I would point to in brain research. Um, One is the notion of causal production, the idea that there are causes that produce things. And one way to illustrate this is just asking the question, like, what in the brain causes us to read? Is that all parts of the brain that see and then the reading bits of the brain? Or is that the special reading bits of the brain that transform,
Yeah.
say, shapes into letters?
Yeah.
And so some brain researchers do like to reserve that word cause for those parts of the brain, like the visual word form area,
Mm,
because those parts of the brain cause reading in ways
mm,
that, whereas other
yeah,
parts of the brain, like your eye, are just responsible for seeing, but not reading per se. Then there's, so that's kind of a domino chainy way of thinking about the brain. And then, yeah, you can move to the more complex systems way of thinking about it, which is it's due to the counterfactual, anything that influences an effect, meaning that if you perturb it, it would be different.
mm,
Causes reading. So if you don't have eyes, you can't read. That eyes cause
mm.
reading. But that also kind of opens up this big
Yeah.
like, then everything causes reading,
Yeah.
right? So
Without
a
the book, you
volcano
can't read.
erupting causes reading
Yeah.
insofar as it
Yeah.
bothers you and you can't read
Yeah.
anymore,
Yeah.
right? So
Right.
yeah, so I think
Mm,
conceptually, this took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around and puzzle out,
mm,
and big conversations within our community. Like, what is it that we should think about we're trying to do here as brain researchers?
yeah.
And I just keep converging on that thing that you and I keep talking about. We're here
Yeah.
to build models, right? We're here
Yeah.
to build models of how phenomenon of interest come to be, and it's not a question about yes, no checklists.
Mm,
It is about did this cause it or not? It's
mhm.
about how these different influences interact in order to produce the phenomenon of interest.
Because I certainly, I mean, it's well, I certainly agree with that. That it's you have to build models. That's sort of the goal, and sort of store your knowledge in models essentially.
Mhm.
And then I have the question: is when you want to deal with these systems, is mathematical modeling unavoidable? Can you sort of build sort of a edifice of
Mhm.
these bricks, or build a theory for complex adaptive systems with words?
With words, I think what it means to understand something is a very thorny question, which there are
Hmm.
many different opinions about, right? So I think when we have these conversations, it's really important to state the end goal. Insofar as the end goal is creating new treatments for brain disorders to help the millions of individuals who are suffering from some type of condition, I think, yeah, in some cases, like we just talked about the history, right? You can intuit what might work, just kind of like thinking through these word models, and that might get you to insight that leads you to a new treatment, right? And so I think we should be open to that. I don't think everybody who's a brain researcher needs to be a mathematical modeler. At the same time, when I look at the complexity of, for example, the genetic network that controls leukemia,
Mm,
it's just no individual can puzzle that type of thing through.
mm,
And that's just a tiny, tiny slice of the 86 billion neurons in our brain, right? Which is just so much more complex. I can't imagine how we're going to really puzzle through all of this without mathematical models, right? So
mm.
you do you, but yeah, I think having the more math we throw at these really complicated problems, the better. And one could say, that maybe the low hanging fruit has been kind of picked. Maybe the things that we can puzzle through in the brain, we've already puzzled through them, right?
In
And so
words, you
now,
mean? Yeah,
yeah, in
in word.
words, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And now
yeah.
now we need some help.
So,
Yeah, and AI is a different slice of this too, right? So that's a different type of mathematical model, one that we didn't intentionally build, but one that we wire up
yeah.
via like learning, right? And to
Mm.
do what needs to be done.
Because I get, yeah, then we to this sort of what I mean when I mean as I said, I come from physics,
Hmm.
so we are used to this physics type
Hmm.
mechanistic models, and I think you mentioned this, for example, this cancer gene network,
Yep.
which is
Hmm.
sort of like mechanistic. It's not physics, maybe it depends on how you define physics, but it's certainly
Hmm.
the mechanistic approach, which then led to like some kind of development of a cure for some, was it leukemia or something, or
Yeah, yeah. It's puzzling through what in that network so yeah, cancer in general is just you've shut off normal cell death, right? And
Mm,
so you want to turn it back on again. And so
mm,
what genes in that network are the ones that are actually controlling,
mm.
apoptosis, normal cell death? And so it led to identifying the right genes in the network, which then gave leads on therapies. Yeah, yeah. So that's the
So
idea.
is that the kind of models you think, mechanistic model? Is that sort of what you
Yes.
have in?
Yeah. So I think we can think about that in two ways. One, we could think about it from a technological perspective, like what type of therapy are you targeting will
Mm,
inform what kind of model you need. So drugs
mm,
interface with molecules, and so if you want a drug therapy, then you
mm.
better be modeling at the level of molecules.
Yeah.
But I think it also is important to fill in that missing gap that's been missing for so long, and that is manipulating those molecules in the brain has to do something with brain activity, right, in
Mm,
order to give rise to
mm.
function and dysfunction. And so we want a
That's
multi-level model, not just what's
mm.
happening
That,
like at
yeah,
the
that's
level of
true.
molecules. But if you're interfacing with a brain stimulation type of therapy, you probably don't need molecules in your model if what you're trying to do is perturb just the brain activity patterns in the network.
But
So
you
at that
need
point, you can get a
neuron.
more
That's what
you
we are
need an
doing. No,
algorithmic
but
type of
more
model,
also
right?
no.
Yeah. More
This
of a
is
neural
actually
network.
what we're doing in our group. We actually
Hmm.
work on how neurons are affected by current. Yeah, so
Stimulation.
that's simulation. So it's like anyway. So that's but anyway, that's
Yeah.
not important.
Yeah.
But when you talked about sort of going to these higher states, I mean higher, well, this what's called this higher levels of the
Mhm.
brain models there, and not only at the level of molecules when you want to understand immediate action of drugs, but even these models at the higher level, should also be in mathematics, shouldn't they? Or
Yes, yes,
no.
yes. That could
So
be,
if
yeah,
you
it could be
need sort
more.
of, so in some sense, it would be models in terms of this thing affects this thing and this thing affects back. Or I mean, it's like
Yeah,
so it
mechanistic
would
in that
be
sense.
mechanistic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it could be,
Mm.
yeah, kind of deep neural network type models of the brain, for example, and to the degree to which we want to call those mechanistic, right? But yeah, they're
Yeah.
more abstract. You're abstracting neurons, and they're not
Yeah. So
dendritic
then I
compartment
guess
models necessarily, right?
no, that's but also I guess it's all the question of how can you interpret sort of like the inner parts of a trained AI model, right? That's sort of I mean, you need if you want to intervene with something, you need more than just sort of a prediction of input versus output, don't you? You need maybe some information about what's really going on inside this between the input and output.
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Like
Yeah,
and it depends a little bit on exactly what do you want to do, right?
yeah,
Do you want to go in and create an electrical perturbation? Could
mm,
you do that with, an input to the system, right? Like
mm,
showing some sort of images or something.
mm,
Yeah, I think this whole class of approach we're talking about is really shaping the type of model you want around the
mm,
technology you have for the therapy and how you think that works, and like
mm,
targeting the models
yeah,
at that.
mm,
So that's one approach. And then I think there's a complementary approach to this, right? And that is we're not going to come in to this thinking we a priori know what type of therapy is right. We're just trying to
okay,
model the system with as much detail as we can. And
mm,
once we get a very complicated model of the system, then we're going to kind of infer what the best
mm.
therapeutic intervention might be.
So
And
so
those
do you see
models can
the
get
yeah.
very, very complicated.
Yeah, but it,
And
you see sort of so then maybe like a combination of mechanistic models and more like
mhm.
AI models, or
Yeah, I think that's the
I don't,
question, like,
yeah,
how would you wire up one of those models, right?
yeah. How would you
Right? Okay, when
construct
they
the
get
model?
really
Yeah.
complicated, you're gonna have some sort of, machine learning type scheme, I think, to just wire them up to get them to do anything. So it
Mhm.
would be, yeah, some combination of those 2,
Yeah. No,
perhaps.
it's that's yeah. Well,
Mhm.
that's certainly something to explore how to get these things to mechanistic models and more these AI models to
Mhm.
interact and work together and sort of yeah. So okay, that was challenge 2, and the challenge 3, of course, is very much related to this of understanding and predicting, and that is how to control them.
Yeah.
Then you need to do some kind of perturbations, right?
Mhm.
And I guess when it comes to it's like it's either I guess it's either drugs or it's some kind of electrical magnetic stimulation or some kind of behavioral talk therapy thing. That's like the 3 options maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that those are the 3 broad classes, absolutely. Yeah, and the one that's going to be right is going to depend on the type of
Yeah.
system you're working in. Yeah, there's not
Mm.
going to be a universal answer, right? We're not going
No.
to cure Alzheimer's with behavioral talk therapy,
No.
right?
Mm.
But it might be the only solution for depression, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So yeah. One thing which I really liked about your book and what you said, and is that it's what you really want to do end up with, or you want to have like a grand plan for neuroscience
Mm-hmm.
and in your head. And I think that's a very, I think we all should think about this. I mean, we all, I think, like as working scientists or students, sort of, well, starting doing some research, it's always going to be in a rather small, well, narrow problem. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
that's in order to make some progress. You can't address everything at well at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I guess it still would be good that all of us to have some idea about what is the point of the overall endeavor of neuroscience research. That's, I guess, what you mean by a grand plan.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think.
you have
Mhm.
seen the light. You have a grand plan.
I have a grand plan. Yeah, so I think we can think about the grand plan in a couple of different ways.
Mhm,
The grand plan is I like, yeah, to describe it is just this description in very broad strokes about
mhm,
how an entire community of researchers really
mhm,
thinks about it's the ethos of an era, thinks about traversing from where they are to progress, whatever that means.
mhm,
And I think it's important when we start to talk about the grand plan is to acknowledge that it has a diversity of end goals. So we want to understand brains for a lot of different reasons, and they're not all the end goal of treating brain dysfunction. I focused on that one in Elusive Cures because
mhm,
that's the one that I was trying to puzzle through. It seems to be the one frustrated. But we also want to understand brains to understand ourselves, right? We're curious, and that is a worthy goal in and of itself. I want to say it again, is a worthy goal in and of itself. And I think that that's what brings so many of us as brain researchers to the table is curiosity, right? But we also want this curiosity to be a win-win for society, and society is looking for us to us
mhm,
for other tangible benefits, like understanding brains also to build things like them. So that's the neuro AI enterprise, and of course, understanding the brain to treat its dysfunction. And yeah, so if you rewind back to the ethos, the grand plan of the 1990s, it can be summarized by phrases like find the broken domino and fix it. And so, one of the questions is if we think about the grand plan of this era, and we think about shifting to thinking about the brain in this new way where we embrace more of its complexity, what is our grand plan? What is it when we fast forward 30 years from now and we look back and we say, what was the genius of the 2020s across our community, right? Not
mhm,
just any one
mhm,
individual. And I do think it's going to be a shift to think about the brain as a complex adaptive system and infer its, what is its adaptability, what is its fragility, and how do we control it to shift it from disease to health insofar as we're talking about this their goal. I do think that that will be the grand plan that we'll point
mhm,
to in 30 years and say, oh yeah, that's the thing that we started to do, and it unlocked success for all of these formidable conditions.
mhm,
So that's what I would argue is the grand plan. But part of this is and I do want to emphasize this. When I wrote Elusive Cures, I did not write this from the perspective of Nicole Rust as the genius who's going to come in and come up with a grand plan and boss everybody around. That was not
no,
Elusive Cures. Elusive Cures was in part me trying to puzzle through. I can
yeah,
see that our 1990s grand plan is not the grand plan anymore, but what is
mhm,
it, right?
mhm,
And how can I infer what our community is doing as a whole and then tap into that genius so I can contribute? But it's
mhm,
also meant to start this conversation. I don't know expect that everyone's going to get on board with this grand plan, which is what I infer
mhm,
the genius of this era to be. There could be
yeah,
like a whole multitude of grand plans. So,
mhm,
and I think there should be, right? That's this idea of pluralism. So pluralism is
yeah,
the idea that we want to throw multiple darts at the dartboard, right?
mhm,
Because we never know which ones are going to hit.
yeah.
But yeah, so that's how I think about the grand plan, and that's certainly yes, it's my grand plan, but I think it's also our community's grand plan.
I
What's
absolutely.
your grand plan? What
No,
are
exactly. So I
yeah.
mean, you know, no, I think, I mean, yeah. Sort of. I think. Well, for one thing, I think it reflects the. I remember one thing you actually say. I think you were sort of excited by reading the book The Astonishing Hypothesis back in the days, right?
Yes, I was. Yes, very
And
reductionist. Very. Yeah.
yes, but for me, when I read that, I was just I mean, I just started doing neuroscience.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, the what it was for me, it was just the obvious hypothesis. How could it be different? Meaning,
Okay.
but you, of course, you come from a psychology department where
Yeah.
so what is this? So this idea that the brain is a physical system that everything with
We are our brains is
we
basically the
are our brains,
astonishing
yeah,
hypothesis. Yeah. Yeah.
which
We're
is
no
sort of
more than our
but that
brains. Yeah.
so it really struck me that so for
Hmm.
me, of course, I came maybe with this maybe this sort of naive sort of this building the brain as a physical system,
Hmm.
and I still I still believe in that, right? But that's only
Hmm.
as one part of the whole endeavor,
Hmm.
because of course what is very special with this system that it has like this. It has also this the one person perspective, right? And when you have that you actually have this, the people are conscious, and the physical systems that consciousness has not been an important part of when I studied like semiconductors or
Hmm.
materials, right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
there's obviously additional things
Hmm.
when it comes to brain science compared to the studies of dead matter. But still, I think this making the also understanding the brain as a physical system is
Hmm.
pretty sort of pretty important.
Hmm.
So that is sort of my
That's
and
true.
my. But otherwise, I think sort of I certainly agree with. For me, it also seems that this thing of importance of mathematical modeling, that
Hmm.
mathematical modeling should be a component in sort of like in many neuroscience research projects now, and of course
Hmm.
because that's one thing is that if you look at the as like sort of like there's always a sociology or a culture of a field, right? And now
Hmm.
until now it's and that's always been dominating by sort of what's been popular in the past, right? Those
Hmm.
are the people having position, and then those are the people in position that make the make sort of like decisions about sort of what projects to fund, what papers to accept in high profile journals, and so there
Hmm.
are all these other issues, and that's so so one question is sort of how should we train next generation of neuroscientists, and sort of
Hmm.
what is your advice to young researchers?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely the word differential equations comes to mind,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
I would love it if every, introduction to neuroscience, undergrad and graduate program required it, right? So just
mm,
trying to wrap your head around it's just an entirely different way of thinking about, just how things change in time and what happens when you have recursive kind of feedback loops. That seems to me to be one of the big missing pieces of a lot of training programs that I see today. Um, yeah, and shifting away from thinking about so especially in, for example, psychology, there's a lot of obsession about is something a cause or is it an effect? Right?
mm,
Like trying to differentiate those two. And it's like, well, that maybe it's not so clean about causes and effects, right? There's causes that are effects. So again, this kind of time varying kind of
mm,
questions about complexity. I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm very excited for our field to have more of it.
mm,
So I teach, like I said, I teach introduction to neuroscience to
mm,
first year university students, and the entire way it's presented is a very domino chainy way from the
mm,
start. And so rethinking education from the earliest stages and how thinking about how did ecology make that shift. So I think weather and climate never really thought about things as a
mm,
domino chain, right? That was always a bunch
yeah,
of nonlinear differential equations that were interacting or in the early 1900s. In ecology, there were these food chains that at some point became food webs, right? And
mm,
then we clearly got the foxes and the rabbits and the emergence
yeah,
isolation, right? And so that's kind of the 101 of complex systems. What are the principles that we should be teaching from the earliest stages?
mm,
Or is it we don't teach those from the earliest stages? We teach those a little bit later. I
mm,
don't. I'm not quite sure.
mm.
Yeah, but time varying, time interacting, nonlinear differential equations. Those are things I would throw out. What would you add to
No, I
that?
think I mean it's I think that's it's always good to learn about. I think Darwin also said that he should have learned more math actually, or one of these sort of like
Yeah.
anyway,
Hmm.
so no, but I mean this is of course this is the theoretical neuroscience podcast, so I think that many
Hmm.
of the listeners are students who are then
Hmm.
studying computation neuroscience or something. I think all the students too. So I guess what one thing you're saying is that your skills are needed.
Absolutely. No question. And they're needed in ways in places that I think are very not intuitive. So
Mm,
emotion research needs you.
mm,
Mood research needs you.
yeah,
Psychosis needs you, right?
yeah,
It's the hardest problems, the ones that are the
mm,
least mathematical that I think
mm,
need the math the most. If you tell
mm,
a vision scientist, right, we should use math, they're just going to nod their heads. Of course, that's what we're
yeah,
doing, right? But there are
mm,
entire fields that are just built up with incredibly elaborate theories. Like you can't even believe how elaborate these theories are, and there's no math behind them. And
yeah,
so there are lots of a century of debates
yeah,
about like
exactly.
whose theory is right, and
Yeah,
it's just a very different way to do science. Yeah.
yeah, and it's a bit so unprecise that it's very difficult to falsify theories, probably, or to. So yeah, mm,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and
so it's
what
difficult to
even
make
does
progress.
your theory predict? It's very hard to, yeah,
Yeah,
because if you
thanks.
don't know what a theory predicts, then it's really hard to falsify, right? Yeah, because you can
Mm.
always worm around to
I
something
also
else.
think just on a very sort of like more like mundane level. I mean, I sometimes when we submit papers to some of these high profile journals,
Hmm.
sometimes the reviewers say, well, this is sort of interesting, but there's no data in it, so it doesn't, so it cannot be. So this thing of actually sort of trying to use bricks which are already there
Yeah.
to build an edifice, that is something that should maybe get more, maybe more appreciated.
I could not agree with you more than that. Yeah,
Mm,
our funding agencies and our
mm,
journals, they want to buy data, and that is just really so misguided. I think we need to figure out what to do with the data, right? And I
yeah,
think we're entering that era more than ever before, where we're going to
mm,
have more data than we know what to do with, and
mm.
so it
So,
shouldn't be that data
but
is
I
the
mean
only thing valued.
that's there are plenty of good journals that actually published this edifice building paper, well, ideas also. So that shouldn't be,
Hmm.
that's not a deal breaker. It's just a little bit. It could be a help to sort of give them more visibility. Some of these
Yeah.
great ID papers,
Yeah,
and or
I think it
building
is
edifice papers.
important to also acknowledge, yeah, when you talk about some of these ideas, is there are differences in the the sophistication with which you need to review some of these ideas, right? So if somebody has data, you can kind of get a sense of the quality of the data, maybe from looking at the data or just seeing the figures. Models, you have to dig pretty deep into some of the
Mm.
models to really kind of wrap
Ah,
your head around what they are. It just takes longer to review a theory paper than it takes
ah,
to review a data paper often, right? So we just have to
ah,
acknowledge that that's
yeah,
an important investment that we need to make because the results are really important.
ah,
But yeah, I remember my
yeah,
office
that's
mate back when I was in graduate school.
yeah,
It would take him 5 days to review some of these
yeah,
theory papers because he wanted to rederive all the proofs and things, right? And it's
yeah,
just like, wow, that's a big investment when you agree to
yeah.
review for a paper, right?
Yeah, that's I must say he's probably a more thorough reviewer than I am.
Maybe
So
you don't rederive all the math, yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
read right.
you just
So that's it. But I
take your
mean,
word
now
for it.
you are sort of had changed now
Hmm.
to study feelings, emotions,
Hmm.
which I
Yeah,
think, which is I read this. I think one of you wrote a paper with Joe Ledoux,
yeah,
right?
hmm,
And
yeah,
about this, and I've heard
hmm,
some of his excellent books on the
yeah.
emotional brain, and that's
Hmm.
it's very interesting. But it doesn't sound like the lowest hanging complex adaptive system fruit. It's though, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't start. But it's
Yeah.
you're quite bold. You're young and bold, so you have plenty of time.
I don't know about young, but yeah. I mean, for me, when I zoomed out and I looked at all of the functions and dysfunctions, right, and I asked myself, I could zoom back in and study the same problems, kind of from this new perspective, or I could shift to other problems. When I decided to move into the neuroscience of feelings and particularly mood, um, part of it was because I've been thinking about the brain as a domino chain for so long. I wanted a system that really could not be domino chained, and I really
Mm,
believe mood can. You just can't really
yeah,
think of like
no,
mood as a domino chain.
Mm.
Also, when you get to a position like mine, which is wonderfully full of privilege, so I've gotten all the promotions I'm ever going to get, right?
Okay.
And I'm sitting on, yeah, just this big mountain of privilege, and so I can
Mm.
ask myself the question, what am I going to do with all of that? And one thing that is true of motion research is it's not moving forward at the same rapid clip as some of the other brain functions like seeing and memory, which I've worked on, motor control, attention. All of these brain functions are moving forward much more quickly than the neuroscience of feelings for good reason. It's not that, the feeling researchers have been doing things that are necessarily that wrong. It's just that their problem is harder. And the reason their problem is harder is about it's really about an objective benchmark problem. So for all of these other brain functions, you can create a task that has an objective truth. Like if
Mm.
memory, I can show you pictures and I can ask you, have you seen them before? And there is a objective ground truth answer. You have or you haven't. We can measure performance. In the case of feelings, no one knows how happy you are but you. There is no objective truth to that.
Yeah,
There's no
that's true.
external truth. And so it's a
Yeah.
whole different philosophy of science you have to bring to try to
Mm.
uncrack that problem and get through that bottleneck. The way it manifests is that because we have these objective ground truth tasks, we can actually have animals perform those tasks and look at the neuroscience of behavior. And hands down, the best measurements we're going to get ever are going to be from the brains of animals where we can like look inside the brain. In humans, we just can't get the right neural measures to
Mm.
really dig into the relationship. So we can ask humans how they feel,
Mm.
but we can't get the right neural measures, and we certainly can't causally perturb their brains in the way we can animals. So that's the big bottleneck in the neuroscience of feelings that we have to get through. One, it's that subjective experience bottleneck. And two, it's also clearly the neuroscience of feelings is going to require these complex dynamical systems types approaches, not domino chain
Mm.
approaches. So yeah, I just decided,
So,
like
so
life
what
is short. I'm
specifically?
just going to
Yeah,
dive in and figure and work on some of the
that's
hardest
cool.
problems in all of neuroscience because
Yeah,
what do I
I
have
guess
to lose
it's
at this point, And they're fascinating, right? These are the
yeah,
biggest questions,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
So, yeah.
exactly. No, that's true. Whenever I go to a party, people talk about their emotional issues, not about whether they can see
Yeah,
contrast people.
that's true. How does my motor system work, right? Yeah, yeah. No,
Exactly, that's
they're
true.
not
Not
motor. Yeah,
so
it is
that's
universally fascinating. Yeah, to think
yeah.
about these things.
But
Yeah,
I mean,
but
it's also much fewer people in the field, maybe, or maybe
effective
not.
science turns out to be pretty ginormous. But
Okay.
yeah, you probably haven't heard so much about that field
No,
just
but
because
maybe I
like
was
it's so far
thinking.
from you, right? Yeah,
No,
but yeah,
yeah,
it's
maybe
called
no.
effective science. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
effective
it is
science.
a lot of
Also,
psychology. It's less neuroscience, even though at the molecular level there's quite a bit that goes on, right?
okay,
So
yeah.
it's about
No, so
how
that
do
is
antidepressants
obviously.
impact neurotransmission and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Obviously, I would expect that the psychologists have been thinking about this for many years.
Yep, yep, and
But
clinical
maybe on the more.
psychologists, of course, right, and
Yeah,
psychiatrists, right? Like, yeah, it's huge swaths of
yeah,
these
yeah.
fields. Yeah,
Obviously, yeah.
it's
That
fascinating.
is cool. So what specifically are you doing? What is your approach now? I mean,
Yeah. So what's my
into
approach now? Yeah. So we need to build models, right?
yeah.
That's what we need.
We all agree on
And
that. Yeah,
right, yeah, we need to figure out ways to measure things.
yeah.
So I'm I'm very fortunate to be what's called a Simons Foundation Pivot Fellow. So I get a
Ah,
whole
perfect.
year to figure out like what exactly needs to be done and how am I going to do
Ah,
it. But where we've jumped in, so we have our first preprint up on the archive, and where
mm,
we've jumped in is leveraging what I consider to be a genius move that Rob Rutledge, who's now a faculty at Yale, made about a decade ago. And what he observed is that a really great way to manipulate happiness is in a gambling task. So
oh,
when you
yeah,
win, you
yeah,
get happy, and when you
yeah,
lose, you become less so. And
yeah.
because a gambling task exists in a very easy to parameterize world of things
Mhm.
like 50 cents and a dollar, you can
Yeah,
actually build mood, you can build models of how experiences are transformed into happiness. So here's
okay.
how this works. On each trial of the gambling task, you can choose you're either going to get a sure amount of reward, maybe you'll get 50 cents, or you're going to take
Mm,
a gamble where you might win a dollar or you might win nothing. Okay, so it's going to be
Mm.
your gamble. And so we're going to vary those amounts. Every few trials, you're going to play this gambling task. We're going to ask, how happy are you right now on a scale from
Mm.
1 to 20? So
Mm.
it's a subjective experience, still, happiness, and there's no way around that. But what we want to do is we want to build a model of how your happiness fluctuates as you play this task. We
Ah.
can fit those models, and it turns out that they actually work quite well.
Ah.
And so now we have a model of how what your happiness depends on. And it has the characteristics of
Mm.
happiness, including things like your happiness doesn't just depend on what you won on the last trial. So it's not see a
Mm.
tiger, get a mood. It's an integration across many trials. That's what happiness depends on. It also
Yeah.
has interesting features like if you win 50 cents and you picked it will
Mm.
make you less happy than if you won 50 cents and the outcome of a gamble. So rewards
Oh.
make us happy, but
Ah.
surprising rewards make us happier still.
Okay.
So we now have models of how experiences are
Uh,
transformed into moods, the behavioral model. So now we
uh-huh.
want to go into the brain. And
Mm.
now we have to get through this bottleneck of we can't get the neural data out of the human brain that we want because it's just not good data.
Mm.
Um, so we look in the brains of monkeys. We can't ask monkeys how they feel, but here is what we can do. We can make, and this is kind of the scandalous assumption that we make,
Yeah.
we can make the assumption that what modulates a monkey's happiness is
Mm.
the same thing that modulates a human's happiness.
Yeah.
And we can go in and look for the neural correlates of these things in the monkey brain.
Mm.
What I forgot to tell you is these models in humans, they're quite universal. So if we fit a model of happiness to me or 53 people and we
Mm.
predict your happiness, it will be a pretty good model.
Yeah.
So we assume that the same models are making monkey happiness fluctuate too. And then
Mm.
we go into look for the neural correlates of the representation of happiness in the monkey brain. And we find them. We find that so monkeys are playing the exact same gambling task, right?
Mm.
They're
Yeah.
as the humans were. And we find that in this somewhat magical brain area called the insula, there is
Mm.
this persistent representation of happiness that maps really beautifully onto the
Oh.
behavioral models. So it also
Oh.
depends on it's a running average. It's the
Yeah.
persistent representation continuously across this population, as if you have this big giant recurrent
Mm.
neural network. It's integrating, showing the result of an integration across time. And so we're now starting to crack open how are these experiences of wins and losses, how are they transformed into this
Oh,
persistent
that's
representation of
cool.
happiness with the end
Yeah.
goal of a big model, not just of this one brain area, but a big
Yeah.
model of the entire, all
Mm.
the different brain areas and how they're interacting together,
Mm.
which brain areas are doing experience, which brain areas are doing the integration, and so on and so forth, that we
Oh.
can then use as kind of a platform to help guide our researcher friends who are trying to figure out new therapies for things
Mm.
like transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Oh,
That's
this
kind
is
of the
really cool.
gist in broad strokes of what we're up to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think also
A
so
lot of
that
fun.
I mean, as you said, that the side effect of some of these drugs against Parkinson is that they can get sort of compulsive gamblers, or
Yep,
that people
absolutely.
can
These
change
dopamine
personality.
systems. Yep,
Yeah, so
absolutely. Yep.
that's
Hmm.
interesting. Well, I think first, I mean, this thing of taking, I mean, you took almost off from your research in a couple of years to write this book, or
Not
not
exactly took
completely?
off. No,
No.
I was still running my lab and everything,
Yeah,
but it did come at
something
a
else.
time. Yeah, all of the stars just aligned in terms of I
Mm.
had a team of researchers who were all set up. They were doing experiments. The lab was
Exactly.
funded, which was really fortunate, so I didn't have to write all the grants. But
Mm.
I did draw the line when I started writing the book. I drew the line thinking on the other side of this book, I probably won't want to do the same thing I've been doing up to this point. And so I
Mm.
stopped taking on new students. I stopped writing new grants such that when
Mm.
I emerged on the
Yes.
other side, I could
Yeah,
start with something new without too many obligations of, you know how it works, right?
yeah,
You commit to something and you're kind of committed for 4 or 5 years.
that's true.
So I did draw
That's
the
true.
line there. Yeah. Yeah.
That's true,
But
and you always have to
I
spend
still have a
most.
great team and
Oh.
much of our memory work is still coming out too. So
Mm.
those students and that team is still finishing up.
Hmm. So, well, I think you've done a great service to the field by writing this book. So I thank you for that. So I hope it will sort of stimulate to discussion about these things. This is not a very sort of opinionated sort of opinionated book. So where sort of you have all the answers. So I
Yeah.
think So anyway, so I recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gote. Yes, the book is meant to inspire conversation, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, not to like to place a flag
not to
on a
tout your
stake. Yeah,
horn. Yeah,
absolutely,
blow your horn.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, yes,
And
I too hope it inspires conversation. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really delightful to have this back and forth with you. So thank you.
yeah, likewise. Okay,
Okay.
thanks.
All right. Thanks so much. Yes.